A special thanks to EY95 for recommending this horrific case. Also, pre-warning, this case is graphic and includes descriptions of horrific acts of animal abuse. I know this is a line for a lot of people, so I've set up chapters around this so you can skip forward, and I'll put something on the screen when I'm about to mention it. Anyway, now on with the video. In the early hours of the 7th of June 1992, 18-year-old apprentice hairdresser Katie Rackliff was brutally murdered whilst walking home from a nightclub in Camberley, a town in the south of England. She was subjected to a frenzied attack, being stabbed over 30 times, including through the heart and her genitals, and she was also mutilated. Some of the blows from the knife that killed Katie were delivered with such force that they passed through her body. Police were horrified and believed they were looking for a fully grown man. They couldn't be further from the truth. The killer was aged just 12 years old, and her name was Sharon Carr, one of the youngest female killers in UK criminal history. Even by this young age, she was displaying psychopathic traits and had a pattern of horrific sadistic violence, including amongst the most despicable acts of animal abuse I've covered on this channel. She chose Katie completely at random, simply to experience the thrill of killing, which she found sexually arousing. Carr might have gotten away with this crime, but 2 years to the day that she killed Katie, she stabbed a 13-year-old pupil at school. She was sent to a young offenders institute, and she began bragging about the murder of Katie to friends and family. She also kept diaries in which she documented her crimes and her violent thoughts. Her notes are truly deranged and included her regret that she'd not caused Katie more agony, with her writing, quote, "If only I could kill you again. I promise I would make you suffer more this time. You fucking slag. Your terrified screams turned me on." Sharon Carr has been incarcerated for almost 30 years and is one of the most dangerous women in the UK prison system, who's been dubbed the Devil's Daughter. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Sharon Louise Carr was born on the 21st of December 1979 in Belize, a country on the northeastern coast of Central America. She's the daughter of a woman called Molly, who already had 3 other children by 3 separate men. It doesn't appear that any of these men were involved with raising the children, and Carr never knew her biological father. Soon after her birth, Molly met a man called George Carr, a Royal Army Medical Corps soldier. The pair began a relationship, with George stepping into the role of stepfather for the children. The environment that Carr grew up in was nothing short of hellish, with repeated exposure to mental illness and violence. Specifically, Molly appears to have had significant mental health issues. She was also a follower of voodoo and believed that she had supernatural powers. She would chant spells and sacrifice animals in order to punish her enemies and gain control over other people. Molly would slaughter animals in front of the children and, from the cradle, would teach them about her supernatural gifts. On top of this, George was a heavy drinker and violent, and he would beat Molly and the children. Molly would often give as good as she got, and so the children would also sometimes witness both parents having fistfights right in front of them. The situation with George likely caused Molly to feel out of control in her own life, and so she took out her frustrations on the children, subjecting them to sadistic acts of violence, including beating and burning them. She would also use punishments deliberately designed to cause the children discomfort. On several occasions, she put pepper on Carr's genitals, causing pain, irritation and inflammation. Molly and George married, and the family moved to the UK in 1986, settling on the Old Dean estate in Camberley, a town in Surrey, a county in the southeast of England. However, despite the change of location, the horror of Carr's home life continued. Molly continued performing her voodoo rituals, and it's been reported that she was responsible for a spate of missing cats in the area. Giving an idea of the temperament of Molly and the things the children were witness to, in 1987, she poured boiling hot fat over George during an argument when he tried to end the relationship. This caused serious injuries to both of them, resulting in them both ending up in hospital. Molly appeared at Guildford Crown Court, charged with wounding. She was given a suspended prison sentence and ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment. In court, it was stated that Carr, at this point just 8 years old, had seen this incident and didn't react. She watched the flesh of her mother and stepfather being melted with boiling fat, and it had no effect on her. Even by this young age, extreme violence was completely normal to her. Molly then began a new relationship with a man who was again violent towards her and the children, so the cycle of violence that characterized Sharon Carr's childhood continued. Carr was enrolled at Cornwallis Junior School soon after she came to the UK and seemed to fit in well. Initially, she was a well-behaved, obliging and kind child who gave no indicator of the monster she would become and the horrors she would unleash just a few years later. It was toward the end of Sharon Carr's time in junior school, and when she moved to Collingwood College Comprehensive School at the age of 11 years old, that things began to change drastically. She turned from a sweet, attentive pupil to a violent bully who would revel in victimizing those smaller and younger than her. She also began to develop a fascination with weapons and would regularly come to school with a kitchen knife in her bag, which she would flash to her friends in order to impress them and show to others to intimidate them. She was also disruptive and developed a hatred of authority. She would regularly tell teachers to fuck off and begin throwing things in class. She, like her mother, had an explosive temper and would react with violence and aggression with absolutely no warning and with the slightest provocation. By the age of 11, Carr was hanging out with an antisocial peer group, which included other delinquent children, but also grown men, and they were all involved in petty crime, stealing in order to buy cannabis, which Carr began smoking every day while skipping school. This group would threaten and intimidate locals and passers-by. Sometimes they would prowl the streets of Camberley, driving slowly alongside people, walking on the pavement and revving their engines to scare them, as well as shouting at random pedestrians. Carr loved frightening people, seeing the fear in their eyes. She quickly gained a reputation as a girl not to cross, who was always armed. However, this antisocial behaviour was nothing compared to the sadistic violence she was exhibiting, centred around the estate where she lived. Specifically, when Carr was around 10 or 11 years old, an alarming number of animals began going missing in the local area, later being found nearby, mutilated and killed. It's believed that Carr was responsible for most of this. It seems that some of the animals were killed as part of her mother's voodoo rituals, but this quickly became secondary to Sharon Carr's thrill and excitement from acts of violence and death. Later, it was reported by people who knew her that she decapitated a dog with a spade, but also, most sickeningly, fried live hamsters to death. How many animals Sharon Carr killed or witnessed being killed during her lifetime is unclear. After her arrest when she was 14 years old, it was reported that police found dozens of cat corpses on a common near her home. When Sharon Carr began thinking about killing people is unclear. It was likely for years prior to the murder she committed when she was just 12 years old, and this is what's so fucked up about this case. Due to the train wreck of her childhood, at a time when children her age were playing with their friends, going to the park riding their bikes, hell, even just watching cartoons, Sharon Carr had likely killed countless animals and was devising ways to torture and kill others as brutally as possible, whilst also fantasizing about acts of homicide. Later, she wrote in her diary, quote, "I was born to be a murderer, and I think everything she'd been exposed to and seen had set her down this path. And at the age of just 12 years old, she would reach this destination and show the world how dangerous she really was in an act of pure savagery against a complete stranger." In June 1992, Katie Rackliff was an 18-year-old woman with her whole life ahead of her. She lived in Camberley and was the daughter of Helen and Joseph. She also had a sister called Joanne. At the time of her death, Katie was working as a trainee hairdresser, with dreams of opening her own salon one day, but she would never get the chance. She was also nursing a broken heart, having just split up with her boyfriend. In order to get over the breakup, Katie agreed to go out with a friend of hers on the evening of the 6th of June. They went to a nightclub called Ragamuffins in Camberley Town Centre. Now, there are two different narratives about what happened next. The first is that Katie went to the club and bumped into her ex-boyfriend. She then spoke to him and asked if they could get back together. When he said no, Katie left in tears. However, the other story I've read says that Katie and her friend simply got separated at the end of the night, and so she decided to walk home. Whichever account is accurate, the end result was the same. In the early hours of Sunday the 7th of June 1992, Katie Rackliff was walking the streets of Camberley alone. Unfortunately, also lurking the streets was Sharon Carr, a complete stranger to Katie, who was armed with a 6.5-inch kitchen knife. The pair met somewhere in Katie's way home, but what specifically happened next would never be known for sure, as Sharon Carr gave 3 different accounts of how she ended up murdering Katie. What actually happened is likely an amalgamation of her statements. The police's working theory is that a vehicle must have been involved, as Katie's body was found some distance away from her route home. Likely, Sharon Carr was in a vehicle driven by at least one adult male, potentially more, when they came across Katie walking home. It seems so is believed that Katie was offered a lift and got into the vehicle. I find this very hard to believe. Nothing I've read about Katie suggests that she was an idiot or particularly naive, so her willingly getting into a vehicle with a strange man in the early hours of the morning seems really unlikely to me. I think the car and the other person, or people in the car, were looking for a victim for her to assault or murder. They then saw Katie, a lone woman, walking home, and I imagine that Sharon Carr got out of the car and marched Katie at knife point to the vehicle. Katie was then likely driven to an isolated location somewhere on the outskirts of Camberley. Carr has previously stated that Katie managed to escape and ran off, but was chased and caught by Carr, who then launched a frenzied attack. Regardless of how Katie ended up in the clutches of Sharon Carr, the nature of her horrific death was determined by the injuries she suffered, which police officers described as akin to those inflicted by Jack the Ripper on his victims. Sharon Carr stabbed Katie at least 32 times with a 6.5-inch kitchen knife. She was stabbed all over her body in a frenzy. Katie was stabbed in the liver, stomach, lungs and breasts. The knife was forced between her ribs and straight into her heart. As well as stab wounds to her genitals, it appears that Carr had forced the knife blade into Katie's vagina and anus, causing horrific internal injuries. Katie had also been mutilated by Carr, with her body being sliced open. Some of the stab wounds are passed entirely through Katie's body, showing they had been delivered with considerable force. Thankfully, it appears that Katie died of blood loss rapidly after the attack began, with most of the stab wounds being inflicted after she'd passed away. This speaks to the overkill in this case. Sharon Carr was not just interested in killing Katie, she wanted to utterly obliterate her. Again, we have to speculate what happened next, but Carr was inevitably helped to move Katie's butchered body into the car, and they then drove approximately 4 miles to the town of Farnborough, where her corpse was dumped alongside a wall next to Victoria Road Cemetery. Katie's half-naked, mutilated body was found at 8 a.m. by some boys walking to school, and they ran home in terror to tell their parents. The police turned up quickly and covered Katie's body. It became clear that she'd been killed elsewhere and then transported to the site where her remains had been dumped. The specific location where Katie was murdered, the vehicle used to transport her body, and the other people who were involved have never been traced. Carr did give 2 names to the police, 2 teenage boys, who she said were in the car. However, they were spoken to and quickly eliminated. Those involved are quite likely still out there somewhere. Details of the crime were kept from the press, including the fact that a bracelet that Katie had been wearing had been taken. The cemetery was searched and no clues were found. Katie was found to have not been sexually assaulted, so there was no DNA evidence, there were no fingerprints, no one had seen anything, and this was during a time where CCTV was not as common as it is today, especially around smaller towns such as Camberley and Farnborough. Psychologists were consulted in order to build a profile. They determined that the police should be looking for a well-built male in his 20s or 30s, based on the force used in the murder and the fact that, although Katie had not been raped, the attack was clearly sexually motivated. They also believed that the perpetrator had a criminal history of escalating sexual or violent offences against women. To say that the police had no idea would be an understatement. To be fair, I'm not sure that anyone could have imagined that the murderer was a 12-year-old girl. Sharon Carr was buzzing. She'd killed for the first time and had gotten away with it. She felt emboldened, invincible, and wrote in her diary, quote, "I'm a killer. Killing is my business, and business is good." Had she stopped at this point, it's likely that Sharon Carr would have gotten away with murdering Katie Rackliff, but she wanted to kill again, and it was this bloodlust and her need to brag about her crimes which would be her downfall. It appears from what we know that Sharon Carr didn't attack anyone else for 2 years. However, she did, during this time, continue to kill animals. However, on the 7th of June 1994, the second anniversary of the murder of Katie Rackliff, she decided that she wanted to kill again. On this date, she put a 4-inch kitchen knife into her school bag and went to Collingwood College Comprehensive School. During morning break, she lured a 13-year-old fellow pupil called Anne-Marie Clifford into the girls' toilets on the pretense that she needed help finding a pound coin that she dropped on the floor. When Anne-Marie had her back to Carr, she pulled out a knife and plunged it into her back, all the way out to the hilt. The blade of the knife punctured Anne-Marie's lung, and she fell to the floor. At that moment, a group of 5 girls also entered the toilets and saw what was happening and raised the alarm. Anne-Marie later recalled that Carr stood there, calmly, with a bloody knife in her hand, with a huge smile on her face. Anne-Marie was rushed in critical condition to the hospital, but survived. If she hadn't been found when she was, there's no doubt she would have died. Also, if she'd not been disturbed, it's obvious to me that Sharon Carr would have slaughtered her. The police were called, and Carr was arrested. Throughout everything, she was completely calm. In fact, she seemed to find everything very amusing. She was laughing and smiling as she was led away. In an interview, Sharon Carr fully admitted what she'd done and told the stunned officers that she enjoyed killing cats and had beheaded a dog. After her arrest, Sharon Carr was sent to a mental health assessment unit as there were serious concerns about her behaviour. But instead of submitting to assessments and treatment, she attempted to strangle 2 nurses. This added to the list of charges she was facing, and in early December 1994, 14-year-old Sharon Carr was convicted of plunging a knife into the back of 13-year-old Anne-Marie Clifford and the assaults against the nurses. It's clear that the court could see how dangerous she was, and Sharon Carr was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, which is the wording used when imposing a life sentence on those under the age of 18. So her release would only be directed by the parole board when she was felt to no longer be a danger to society. However, by this point, Carr's violence was fully unleashed. She began to serve her sentence at Rackliff Secure Unit in County Durham, a unit for children who have committed criminal offences, but she immediately started assaulting other children there. She was then moved to the male-only unit at the centre, but the same thing happened again. In September 1995, she was then transferred to H&P Bulwood Hall, an adult women and young offenders prison in Hockley in Essex, due to concerns about her risk, and it being felt that this was the most secure environment to contain her. By this point, the police still had no idea that Sharon Carr was the killer of Katie Rackliff, but this would soon change. Soon after her transfer to H&P Bulwood Hall, as well as continuing to assault other staff and prisoners, Carr was heard bragging about the murder of Katie in phone calls to friends and family. She was also constantly seen writing in her diary. She began to tell staff, including a prison officer and her probation officer, what she'd done, and she showed them what she'd been writing. As we'll get to, she was reveling in what she'd done to Katie, as well as making other deranged statements about her love of murder. In January 1996, just a few months after her incarceration, staff called the police and told them what Carr had been bragging about. They arrested her and obtained a warrant to seize her diaries. Sharon Carr was interviewed over the course of 27 hours, and she confessed to the murder of Katie Rackliff. She was able to give the police details of the crime that only the killer would know, including the fact that Casey's bracelet was missing, as well as the nature of some of her injuries. Carr also admitted to having an extensive history of animal abuse. Detective Sergeant Paul Clements, who interviewed Carr, recalled, quote, "It was almost as if she was in another world. What sticks in my mind about talking to her was the coldness. Most people that you interview show some feeling as to why they've done what they've done. But with her, there was a complete absence of emotion and reason. The police then spent the next few months poring through Carr's diaries, and the content shocked even hardened detectives. The diary entries of Sharon Carr give us a rare insight into the mind of a sadistic, psychopathic killer. These would be shocking enough, but remember, we're talking about a child. The police seized a diary she'd written in 1994 and 1995, and it's clear from her entries that Carr had been replaying the murder of Katie Rackliff again and again over the years, getting a thrill and sexual excitement from the memory of the crime. There are numerous entries, and I'll go through most of them. These were all direct quotes. So, on the 13th of January 1995, Carr wrote in her diary, "Remember KR? Oh God, she did get me going. So hot. Pity really. I think about it, and my head is spinning, but against the cops, I'm winning." On the 7th of March 1995, the entry read, "I bet she's all bone and maggots by now. She shouldn't have tested." On another date, she wrote, "If only I could kill you again. I promise I'd make you suffer more, you slag. Your terrified screams turned me on." Carr also included a description of the murder of Katie, writing, "I bring a knife into her chest. Her eyes are closing. She's pleading with me. So I bring the knife to her again and again. I don't want to hurt her, but I need to do violence to her. I need to overcome her beauty, her serenity, her security. There I see her face when she died. I know she feels her life being slowly drawn from her, and I hear her gasp. I guess she was trying to breathe. The air stops in the back of her throat. I know all her life her breathing has worked, but it does not now, and I am joyful." In September 1995, Carr wrote, "I enjoyed pushing the blade up her. It made me feel powerful. I had to overcome her serenity, her security. She needed to be raped." Carr also had an obsession with marking dates related to the murder of Katie. On the 7th of December 1994, Carr wrote, 2.5 years today, I put that slag in the ground. On the 7th of June 1995, the 3rd anniversary of Katie's murder, Carr wrote, "Killed KR, death by knife wounds and sex go together." In November 1995, Carr wrote in her diary, "Oh damn, I've got a taste for red rum, and God, I want to get drunk. A nasty thought through the night. Pure jealousy makes me want to fight." During the same month, she wrote, "Last night, it occurred to me that killing her did me good. I know what I'm capable of, and will do it again." She also wrote, "I was born to be a murderer. Killing for me is a mass turn-on. It just makes me so high, I never want to come down." And finally she wrote, "Every night I see the devil in my dreams, sometimes even in my mirror, but I realize it was just me." These diaries were Carr's undoing, but also showed the police that they had stopped a likely serial killer in her tracks. In May 1996, Sharon Carr was charged with the murder of Katie Rackliff and awaited her day in court. Sharon Carr appeared at Winchester Crown Court in February 1997 and pleaded not guilty to the murder of Katie Rackliff. She claimed that she'd confessed the crime in order to get attention. The Crown countered this, outlining how Carr had told the police details that only the killer would know. They also used her diary entries against her, showing that Carr was a rational, sadistic killer who had spent years reveling in her crime. Further entries were also presented before the court, as, despite the police taking her diaries away in January 1996, she'd simply gotten another one and continued her scribblings before this too was seized. On the 7th of June 1996, the 4th anniversary of Katie Rackliff's murder, Carr wrote, quote, "Respect to Katie Rackliff, 4 years ago today. Respect to the woman you murdered. Seriously?" Anyway, this entry and others show that Sharon Carr was a girl without remorse or conscience, whose sole focus since killing Katie had been reliving this crime and inevitably fantasizing about slaughtering others. It will be of no surprise that after a trial that lasted 4 weeks, on the 25th of March 1997, Sharon Carr, by this point 17 years old, was found guilty of the murder of Katie Rackliff, with the jury taking just 7 hours to reach their verdict. I've accessed a news report from the time, and it was reported that Carr burst into tears when the jury read out their verdict. But then she switched in seconds and began laughing and chatting to her lawyers. She then stood before Judge Scott Baker for sentencing. He said, quote, "What is clear is that you had a sexual motive for this killing, and it's apparent both from the brutal manner in which you mutilated the body and chilling entries in your diary. The killing, as you put it, turns you on. You are, in my view, an extremely dangerous young woman." He then sentenced her. For the murder of Katie Rackliff, Sharon Carr was detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, so again essentially a life sentence, with a minimum tariff of 14 years being set before she could apply for parole. It's reported that Carr listened impassively whilst being sentenced, but then swaggered from the dock with a huge grin on her face as she was taken away. Katie's father Joseph punched the air and shouted yes when Carr was found guilty, and after her sentence told reporters, quote, "She should have been hanged. We'll be grieving for the rest of our lives." The savagery of Sharon Carr's crimes, her diary entries, and mention of voodoo led to her being dubbed the Devil's Daughter in the press, something I have no doubt she loved. The story of Sharon Carr is far from over. She has proven to be one of the most disruptive and dangerous women in the prison estate in the almost 30 years since she's been incarcerated. After her conviction in 1997, Sharon Carr was sent to H&P Holloway, a women's prison in London. From literally the moment she was there, she began assaulting other prisoners and staff. This was not a rare occurrence. Carr would, literally, every time she was able to get her hands on someone, beat them up. This meant she spent most of her time in the segregation unit, cut off from other prisoners for their safety. When she was allowed out of her cell, this was under the supervision of multiple guards. Carr then began displaying bizarre behaviour, claiming that she was a lizard, and even going so far as apparently cutting open her skin to see whether there were scales underneath. She was subsequently sent to Broadmoor Maximum Security Hospital in 1998, where she was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. I'll return to this later, but this is a mental health condition where a person displays symptoms of both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, so this can include delusions, hallucinations, and psychosis, i.e. a disconnect from reality. At Broadmoor, which is an environment set up to manage the worst of the worst, Carr was a menace. Again, the only thing she did was assault both staff and other patients. However, she apparently found love here. And yes, I'm being sarcastic. In the year 2000, when she was 20, Carr met a fellow patient called Robbie Lane, who was 23 years old. They apparently fell in love, and 9 months after meeting, Lane proposed, and Carr said yes. The pair were then given permission to marry in Broadmoor. When this was reported in the papers, it caused uproar, and rightly so, especially when the background of Lane was disclosed. In 1994, Lane had battered his mother, Linda Pennell, to death, as well as stabbing her in the face and head at least 29 times before gouging out both of her eyes. He was apparently upset that she preferred his sister to him. Some reports appear to indicate that this marriage made in hell actually happened, but the majority suggest that everything was ready to go, with the rings having been bought from Argos, but then both read about the other's crimes in the paper and broke off their engagement, due to each apparently finding the other's crimes reprehensible. That's almost laughable to think that either of these two felt they had the moral high ground. Despite her brutal crimes and the way she was behaving in Broadmoor, Sharon Carr felt aggrieved. She complained that her minimum tariff of 14 years was too harsh. She wanted this reduced so she could get out sooner, and also she wanted her murder conviction thrown out and replaced with one of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Essentially what Carr was trying to argue was that because she'd now been diagnosed with a mental health condition with features of psychosis, when she killed Katie Rackliff, she wasn't in full command of her faculties and therefore couldn't be held responsible for her actions. Her arguments were heard at the Court of Appeal in October 2003, and luckily, every argument was thrown out. Whilst it was acknowledged that Carr had since been diagnosed with a mental health condition, this was not assessed as being relevant to why she committed the murder in 1992. In terms of being released early, the court considered Carr's long history of violence in custody, including the fact that literally days before the hearing, she had, quote, admitted wanting to kill a fellow inmate by slitting her throat. Carr remained at Broadmoor until 2007, when it switched entirely to only accepting male patients, and she was then moved to Rampton Maximum Security Hospital in Nottinghamshire. Whilst there, she was in good company, including rubbing shoulders with people like Beverly Allett, a nurse who, in 1991, killed 4 babies and tried to kill another 3. Again, this hospital was used to house some of the most dangerous people in the country, but Carr continued to push the boundaries. She was assaulted patient after patient, staff member after staff member, and repeatedly told others about her fancies of killing anyone she could get her hands on. In February 2015, the mental health service was sick of Carr, and she was discharged and sent back to the prison estate, specifically being sent to H&P Bronzefield in Surrey. It was determined that Sharon Carr was untreatable, and so there was no point in her remaining in a secure hospital. Back in prison, Sharon Carr was determined to raise hell, and the assaults began racking up, and she has, up to the present day, spent most of her time in segregation, with her access to other prisoners being restricted, and she requires a team of officers to monitor and move her around the prison. If given the chance, they're confident that she'd kill again. In 2019, Sharon Carr again felt hard done by. Despite the fact she continued to assault anyone and everyone she could get her hands on, she felt aggrieved by the security measures used to manage her in the prison. She wanted more freedom to demonstrate that she'd apparently changed. However, to any rational person, this was essentially her wanting a green light to carry on what she'd been doing for the last 25 years at this point, hurting anyone she wanted and potentially killing them. Carr also moaned about the fact that, although she'd been eligible for parole since 2011, no one had released her. Seriously, during this bit, I was going to include some audio of a man playing a violin. In the year 2020, there was a hearing at the Court of Appeal where Carr's points were roundly dismissed. Just like with their hearing at this court in 2003, it was Carr's own behaviour that came back to haunt her, when it was revealed that she'd been having fancies about, quote, wanted to murder another resident by splitting her head open with a flask and throwing her down the stairs to snap her neck. So as of February 2024, Sharon Carr, aged 44, remains safely behind bars. She's one of the most dangerous women incarcerated in the UK. She has now, since her arrest in 1994, spent almost 30 years behind bars, and I cannot imagine any situation where she'd be safe to be released. Sharon Carr is likely to die behind prison walls, rightfully in my opinion, as the horrors she caused in just 2 short years is nothing compared to what she would do if she was back in the world again. She is a serial killer in the making. She will remain a danger to society until the day she leaves this earth. The more cases I cover on this channel, the more complicated the profiles of the offenders seem to become. This is especially true in the case of Sharon Carr. Her crimes are so far removed from what we expect a child to be capable of. Luckily, as I've covered some horrific monsters, we can draw on other profiles to understand the crimes of Sharon Carr. In this section, I need to divide things into 2. Firstly, talking about her love of violence, and then also her choice of targets and why. So as I was making this video, the more Sharon Carr's background reminded me of the case of Adolfo Constanzo, a cult leader who had a group called the Narco Satanists in a ranch just outside the Mexican border city of Matamoros in the 1980s. Both Constanzo and Carr were raised by mentally unstable women who thought they had supernatural powers, believed in voodoo, and used animal sacrifice as a way to gain power. Both, from a very young age, were exposed to this horrific behaviour and participated in these rituals, so that both of their childhoods were solely characterised by blood and violence. Carr and Constanzo grew up to revel in violence. They enjoyed the power of life and death they had over living creatures, beginning with animals and proceeding to humans, and they both got a thrill and sexual excitement from these horrific acts. As extreme violence and death was normalized in the lives of both Constanzo and Carl at such an early age, they quickly needed to engage in more extreme acts of torture and murder to get the same rush. With Constanzo, this would culminate in him being in charge of a cult which murdered at least 16 people, including American student Mark Kilroy. So I think you can see, despite these two cases being entirely different in terms of the gender of the perpetrators and the decade and geographical location they grew up in, they had very similar profiles based on the same horrific childhoods. With Sharon Carr, her background was, in some ways, even worse than her dog or Constanzo's, as her mother Molly was a sadist, a woman who enjoyed abusing her own children. So on top of being involved in animal sacrifices and being indoctrinated with mumbo-jumbo about supernatural powers, blah blah blah, Carl was also specifically shown that violence was something to enjoy. Harming others was a way to gain pleasure. As a result, her thirst for violence and the desire to harm others was, in some ways, even more pronounced than Constanzo's. By the age of 10 or 11 years old, Carl was so desensitized to violence and so focused on acts of sadism that she was devising the most horrific ways to torture animals, including decapitating dogs and frying live hamsters. However, it's clear this didn't satisfy her, and she wanted to escalate to murdering a human being, but not just killing them. She wanted to utterly destroy them. She wanted to see the terror in their eyes, knowing that they were about to die. She wanted to hear them beg for their lives and listen to their screams as she stabbed them repeatedly. Knowing she was the one doing these things and causing this reaction made her feel like a god, utterly powerful. This feeling was intoxicating, and in the absence of being able to do it again, Sharon Carr replayed this in her mind again and again and again. The killing of Katie Rackliff was, to her, her greatest accomplishment. Obviously, both cases I've mentioned so far are extreme examples, but nonetheless, they demonstrate the impact that exposure to violence can have on a child, how it can distort their perception of the world, and also, importantly, it highlights the role of shitty parenting in creating these monsters. And this brings me on to the second strand of this case, Sharon Carr's choice of target. Whilst Carr's use of violence seems completely random on paper, when you look into it, it isn't at all. While she has assaulted men over the years, it appears this has been as a result of a situation, for example not getting her own way. However, it's clear that she has specifically gone out of her way to target women, actively seeking them out in order to hurt them. They've always been her main target. Her killing Katie Rackliff was not, in my opinion, an arbitrary decision. I think she targeted her because she was a woman. In this respect, there seems to be a clear theme of Sharon Carr being a misogynist. No doubt people might roll their eyes saying, she's a woman, how can she hate women? It's a bit like the argument, well, he's black, so he can't have a hatred of black people. I get it, it seems like it shouldn't make sense, but ultimately we don't choose our gender and our race, and this doesn't insulate us from having prejudicial views of the same gender and race, although it's obviously far more common to be discriminatory towards those who are dissimilar to you. However, I have met men who hate other men, women who despise other women, and black and Asian people who are fervently racist towards those of the same ethnicity. The common feature across all of these examples is childhood abuse. So for example, a man who as a child was abused by another man who's grown up to hate that gender. And this makes sense if you look at the case of Sharon Carr. She was raised by a woman who abused and tortured her and exposed her to constant violence. I think that Carr, due to the terrible woman that her mother Molly was, develops a hatred of women. In my opinion, credibility to this comes not only in the fact that she specifically seems to have targeted women throughout her life, but also her language related to Katie, calling her a slag and saying she deserves to be raped. Also, look at where she stabbed her. She aimed at her breasts and stabbed her in the vagina. She aimed at the things on her body that defined her as a woman and sought to utterly destroy them. I've read reports that Sharon Carr has, since she was a child, dressed predominantly in male clothing. I think this may have been her way to try and move away from the gender that she is, for which she utterly despises. So together you have a woman whose whole childhood was characterized by extreme violence, guided by a mother, and I use that term loosely, who would abuse and victimize her, which resulted in an extremely dangerous child, now an adult, who associates violence with power, enjoys torturing and killing others, and despises women, or will actively seek them out, to live out her fantasies of butchering another human being. Her childhood also meant that she was never taught remorse, empathy or guilt. She is a psychopath, so she's able to do these things without any regrets. I haven't really mentioned the diagnosis that she received of schizoaffective disorder, because I really don't think it's relevant to understanding Sharon Carr. Since being incarcerated, it seems clear her mental health has deteriorated, and she has been delusional on occasions. But when she killed Katie Rackliff, she was in her right mind and was in full control of her actions. She was purposefully seeking out ways to fulfill her homicidal fantasies. Her diary entries also show the same thing. They show a girl, fully in control, who was reveling in an act of horrific and savage violence. I've no doubt if Sharon Carr was released, she would commit her life to killing as many people as possible, leaving a trail of bodies in a condition which would likely lead to repeated parallels with the crimes of Jack the Ripper. The Snowtown murders involved the killing of 12 people between 1992 and 1999 in Australia by a group which included Robert Wagner and James Velasquez, and the ringleader being a man called John Bunting. Bunting, a former abattoir worker, was a sadistic psychopath who would target people at random to be eliminated due to them being suspected of being paedophiles, being homosexual, or for any other reason he concocted to enable him to torture and murder other human beings. Bunting would get his victims to call him, quote, Lord and Sir, and liked to look into his victims' eyes when they were murdered. None of the perpetrators or victims were from Snowtown, which has become synonymous with this case, and only one of the murders occurred here. But this is the place where the 7-year crime spree came to an end, when the dismembered bodies of 8 people were found in 6 barrels of acid stored in a disused bank vault in the town. This is a story of absolute depravity, and is, by number of victims, the worst serial killing case in Australian history. Welcome to Evil Among Us. This story begins with John Justin Bunting, the leader of the group of murderers responsible for the horrors in this case. He was born on the 4th of September 1966 in the suburb of Inala in the city of Brisbane, which is the capital of the state of Queensland in the northeast of Australia. Bunting has claimed that on one occasion when he was around 8 years old, he was sexually and physically abused by a friend's older brother, which led him to develop a lifelong hatred of paedophiles. Also during his childhood, Bunting is known to have killed animals. He started small, spending a lot of his childhood dropping insects into acid and watching them dissolve. As he became a teenager, Bunting escalated his behaviour to torturing, killing and skinning cats, reveling in their pain as they died. By the time that John Bunting was around 13 years old, he was a fervent homophobe and racist. He bought a copy of Mein Kampf and read it cover to cover, began to idolise Adolf Hitler, going to the point where he spray painted a large swastika on the side of his car. He also joined a neo-Nazi gang, an association with similarly bigoted people, inevitably led to his prejudicial views being compounded, and it appears expanded to those with mental and physical disabilities, drug users, and essentially anyone who he considered inferior, or those who simply annoyed him. John Bunting developed an internal quote-unquote code of those who he deemed worthy of elimination, but, as will be shown, this was often on the flimsiest of evidence and was extremely fluid. Essentially, John Bunting was a very dangerous man, and simply being in his orbit meant you were risking your life, as, at any moment, you may have violated his code and end up being tortured and butchered by a man who had no empathy and no remorse for his actions. Bunting's chosen professions appeared to be an extension of his emerging fascination with death. At the age of 20, he got a job in a crematorium and seemed to really enjoy the task of destroying human bodies. At the age of 22, he got a job at the South Australian Meat Corporation, the job he absolutely enjoyed as he was involved in the slaughtering of the animals. He would brag to his co-workers about how many animals he'd killed on any given day. Bunting was, by all accounts, charming and friendly, and this made him even more dangerous. He walked through life undetected, as the dangerous psychopath he was. Behind the scenes, his animal cruelty continued unabated, including him killing and skinning a friend's dog. In private, John Bunting had a fascination with weapons and anatomy. He would read books, learning the best way to dismember and dispose of human remains. Bunting kept his darker side hidden and was able to form and maintain both friendships and intimate relationships, although these always appeared to be characterized by a power imbalance. For example, in January 1993, Bunting met an 18-year-old woman called Veronica Tripp, who married just 8 months later. An important detail about Veronica is that she had significant intellectual disabilities and had the mental capacity of a child. She would, years later, when giving evidence in court about Bunting, do so whilst cuddling a teddy bear. The reason I highlight this is because John Bunting surrounding himself with and targeting those who are vulnerable in some way is a repeating theme. Veronica would later state that after she married Bunting, so essentially when she was trapped, he showed his true colours and she was terrified of him. She claimed not to have been physically abused by him, but was the victim of verbal abuse, a witness to his explosive temper, to the point where, when she discovered details of some of the murders, she kept this to herself for years, for fear that she would become one of the victims. John Bunting committed his first murder when he was 26 years old, but it's clear that by his early 20s, he was a ticking time bomb, a man whose life, up to that point, had been about sadistic acts of violence towards animals and the enjoyment from killing living things. A man who had begun researching how to dismember human beings and who had developed a code which enabled him to justify the elimination of anyone who he considered inferior, with him having no empathy for others and no remorse for his actions. John Bunting stood at just 5 feet 4 inches tall as an adult, and potentially his stature led many to underestimate him. And this, coupled with his ability to charm and manipulate others, meant he operated undetected for years and was able to recruit willing volunteers to help him engage in a killing spree, which I've no doubt he'd been fantasizing about for years. And in 1992, the horror that would become known as the Snowtown Murders would begin. The Snowtown Murders resulted in the deaths of 12 people and occurred over the course of 7 years. Different people were involved in the various murders, with John Bunting, as the years progressed, recruiting people to his cause. The association between the victims and perpetrators often overlap, and some who initially helped Bunting became victims themselves. I'll try to lay out the horror in this case as simply as I can. So the first person to be recruited by John Bunting was a man named Robert Joe Wagner. He was born on the 28th of November 1971 in the city of Parramatta in the state of New South Wales. Wagner's childhood seems to have been characterised by abuse, with him being the victim of a prolific paedophile called Barry Wayne Lane, who, in 1984, when Wagner was 13 years old, groomed him and then began to molest him. Wagner's parents apparently tried to stop the abuse, and, as a response, Barry essentially kidnapped Wagner. And, in 1985, the pair went into hiding for the next 4 years, only re-emerging in late 1989, when Robert Wagner was 18 years old. The pair could live openly as a gay couple. However, they were constantly harassed, as Barry had a history of molesting children, and no one wanted him in the area. What Wagner must have gone through the years of being in the clutches of this paedophile cannot be understated. In 1991, Barry Lane and Robert Wagner were living, apparently in a relationship, at 1 Bingham Road in Salisbury North in Greater Adelaide, when John Bunting and his wife Veronica moved into 203 Waterloo Corner Road, a property approximately 200 metres away. How Bunting and Wagner actually met is unclear, but they were soon spending the majority of their time together. It appears that Bunting believed that Wagner was not actually gay, and that instead he'd been ground down by years of abuse by Barry to believe this. The men bonded over their shared hatred of paedophiles and homosexuals, and their admiration of Nazism. It's reported that both of the men were part of at least one right-wing group, and attended meetings together, before being expelled because their views were too extreme. Over time, John Bunting became close friends with both Robert Wagner and somewhat inexplicably Barry Lane. Barry was the epitome of everything Bunting apparently hated. He was gay and a paedophile. However, it appears that he was useful to Bunting. He would identify men in the local area that were gay, many being friends of his. He would also specifically point out which ones were allegedly paedophiles. In this respect, Bunting tolerated Barry because he was a necessary evil, way to compile a kill list. But, behind his back, he would refer to him as, quote, dirty. One of Barry Lane's friends was a man called Clinton Trezise. who was unapologetic about his sexuality. He was known to people in the area as someone who would often be seen walking around in bright red and purple trousers, leading to Bunting calling him, quote, hacky pants. This was not a term of endearment. That would be something he would say mockingly to Clinton. It seems that Clinton knew Bunting through his association with Barry Lane and Robert Wagner, as he would often spend time at their property. There's little information about Clinton. This is due to how isolated he was. He was apparently estranged from his family and had few friends. I've also read that he had intellectual disabilities. But, despite this, he was a happy, although apparently vulnerable young man. There's no evidence that Clinton had ever harmed a child. However, this didn't stop Bunting determining that he was a paedophile. He used his association with Barry Lane to get information about Clinton and to form a friendship with him, which was solely to get close to his target. The friendship was strong enough that on August the 31st, 1992, John Bunting invited Clinton round to his home at Waterloo Corner Road, and while he sat on the sofa, Bunting approached him from behind and hit Clinton several times on the head with either a shovel or a hammer, fracturing his skull and killing him. An autopsy would later show that Clinton had a broken hand, indicating that he'd put it on his head to try and fend off some of the blows, so he knew he was going to die. When Bunting was sure that Clinton was dead, he wrapped his body in bin bags and summoned the help of Robert Wagner and Barry Lane to help him move the body. Barry offered the use of his station wagon, and Clinton's body was loaded into the back. They drove around 30 miles north of Adelaide to an isolated patch of farmland, where Clinton's body was stripped of its clothing and then dumped in a shallow grave. His body was not found until August the 16th, 1994, almost 2 years later, when farmers ploughing the field came across his final resting place. What is so sad with this murder is how no one noticed or potentially cared that Clinton had gone missing. The only supposed friends that Clinton had were the ones involved in killing him and disposing of his body, and he was not reported missing by his family until late 1995, 3 years after his murder. A picture of Clinton was sent to police in 1995. It was only using this, comparing it to the skull that had been found, that they could identify the remains of a John Doe that had been found a year before. Immediately after the murder of Clinton, John Bunting, Robert Wagner and Barry Lane went back to Bunting's home to celebrate murdering a man they claimed to be a paedophile. Whilst Bunting and Wagner were buzzing, Barry was disturbed by what he'd seen and been involved in. I think at this point it dawned on him just how dangerous Bunting was. Barry told his mother and Bunting's wife Veronica Tripp about the murder of Clinton. Veronica asked Bunting whether this was true. He confirmed that it was, but he swore us to secrecy. She kept this to herself until years later, at her husband's trial. Bunting didn't kill again for over 3 years, but he wasn't idle during this time. He created what was described in court as a, quote, rock spider wall. This is due to the fact that in Australia, child sex offenders are sometimes called rock spiders. This was set up on a wall in Bunting's home and was a set of paper notes connected by lengths of wool, which identified people who Bunting claimed were paedophiles. Bunting would frequently select a name from the wall, call them, and threaten their lives, as well as vandalising their homes and vehicles. As well as this, in the years between the first and second murders, John Bunting was recruiting others to his cause. However, some of these people, when they were no longer of use, would become victims. The third main figure in these crimes is a man called James Spryden Velasquez, who was born on December the 24th, 1979. He's important in this case, not just because of his involvement, but the details he provided during his subsequent confessions, which gives a real insight into the workings of the group, as well as their methods and motives. Velasquez's childhood was nothing short of horrific. His father, a man named Spiros, was a violent dictator in the home and would regularly beat his wife, Elizabeth Harvey, and for years sexually abused not only Velasquez, but also his older half-brother, Troy Eude. It's unclear whether Elizabeth knew what Spiros was doing, but it appears she had her own difficulties, including an addiction to gambling, meaning that she was often out, leaving the children at home with absolute horror. The abuse came to an end suddenly when Spiros died of a heart attack, when Velasquez was around 10 or 11 years old. However, the abuse then began again, when Troy Eude, likely replicating the behaviour of his father, began to regularly rape Velasquez. Things only got worse when, in November 1993, so when Velasquez was 13 years old, Elizabeth was approached by a neighbour called Jeffrey Payne, who offered to help and spend time with the boys. This included not only Velasquez and Troy Yude, but also 2 other children called Adrian and Christopher. Elizabeth was struggling to cope as a single mother, and so agreed. What Elizabeth didn't know was that Payne was a convicted paedophile, and as soon as he got access to the children, he began raping each of them, threatening to kill them if they told their mother. This went on for 2 months until January 1994, when Barry Lane, who we've already met, knocked on Elizabeth's door and told her that Payne was a paedophile. So essentially one child molester was outing another one. Payne immediately fled the area, but the damage had already been done. So by the age of 13 years old, James Velasquez had been sexually abused by at least 3 people. It's clear he suffered from severe PTSD as a result of this abuse. He began to self-medicate, using heroin from a young age to block out his trauma. In April 1994, still when he was only 13 years old, Elizabeth Harvey began a relationship with John Bunting. It's reported in some articles they got married, but I can't see that this is the case. Instead, it seems as though whilst married to Veronica Tripp, Bunting was involved in several sexual relationships with various women, including Elizabeth. Regardless, Bunting being in a relationship with Elizabeth brought him into contact with Velasquez, a child desperate for acceptance and a male role model. Elizabeth was enamored with Bunting, and Velasquez later recalled, quote, "When I first met John, he was so polite, so well-spoken, so well-mannered." Bunting quickly took on a parental role, being 28 years old by this point, 15 years older than Velasquez. Their relationship began normally enough. They would go to the cinema and ride motorcycles together, but Bunting quickly began the grooming process. Bunting was still in the habit of torturing, killing and skinning cats and dogs in the local area, and on several occasions, he did this in front of Velasquez and eventually got him to be involved in this behaviour. Also, Bunting showed his young protege, the wall he created in his home, the information about men in the area he suspected of being paedophiles. Bunting referred to these men as, quote, dirty, and like Robert Wagner before him, James Velasquez was privy to Bunting's rantings about his hatred of these types of people. In December 1995, John Bunting found a perfect target for his homicidal urges, and this came in the form of a 26-year-old man called Ray Davies. Ray was a vulnerable young man with intellectual disabilities, who, in 1993, began a relationship with a woman called Suzanne Allen, who was a former girlfriend of John Bunting. The relationship came to an end quickly when Suzanne's grandsons accused Ray of making sexual advances towards them. Whilst the relationship ended, the pair stayed on good terms, and Ray stayed at a caravan at the rear of Suzanne's property. Christmas Day 1995, Suzanne was spending Christmas with her daughter, Annette Cannon, the mother of the children that Ray was accused of trying to molest. During the celebrations, one of the children stated that Ray had sexually assaulted them, and so the family left to go and report this to the police. Ray Davies was already on John Bunting's radar, due to it being reported that he would sometimes be found masturbating whilst hidden in bushes as young girls walked past. Due to this latest incident, inevitably disclosed to him by Suzanne Allen, Bunting decided that Ray needed to die. On the 25th of December 1995, whilst the family were out, John Bunting and Robert Wagner went to Ray's caravan, dragged him out, handcuffed him, and bundled him into Wagner's car. He was then driven over 90 miles away to a property which Bunting was renting, in a place called Baccarat. Here, Ray was tortured, including being beaten over the head with metal poles. Part of this was to extract his bank information. Ray Davies, by this point battered and bruised but still alive, was driven back and ended up in John Bunting's home at 203 Waterloo Corner Road. Here, he continued to be tortured by both Bunting and Wagner, but apparently also present and involved was James Velasquez's mother, Elizabeth Harvey. What happened next is unclear. It's reported that all 3 took turns beating Ray, with Elizabeth potentially stabbing him up and down his legs with a knife. Jump cables were then placed around Ray's neck, and he was strangled to death. From reports of court proceedings, it appears that Robert Wagner was the man who finally ended Ray Davies' life. Whilst James Velasquez was not present during this murder, both Wagner and Bunting soon told him about killing Ray Davies. John Bunting also told him about the murder of Clinton Trezise in 1992. The men laughed when talking about the murders, and in 1997, after the body of Clinton had been identified, he was the focus of a segment on Australia's Most Wanted, with the programme asking for information. With glee, Bunting pointed at the screen and said, quote, "That's my handiwork." The next person to die was Suzanne Allen. I firmly believe Suzanne was murdered, but at court, The jury was undecided, so no one was convicted for involvement in her death. However, I'll leave it to you to decide. Suzanne Allen is someone we've already mentioned. She was 47 years old in 1996, and despite John Bunting being married to Veronica Tripp and in a sexual relationship with Elizabeth Harvey, he was also sleeping with Suzanne. However, by mid-1996, Bunting got tired of Suzanne, but she was unable to accept the relationship was over. She would send him notes and drive past his property, much to Bunting's annoyance. Sometime in November 1996, Suzanne died in her home. How is unclear. Bunting would later claim she suffered a fatal heart attack in the bathroom. Bunting later told Velasquez that he and Wagner were involved in a, quote, slice and dice, with them placing Suzanne's body in the bath, where they proceeded to skin it and cut it into 11 pieces. The men were clearly enjoying themselves. At one point, Wagner apparently held out Suzanne's severed head and tried to get Bunting to kiss it. Her body parts were then wrapped in plastic bags and buried on top of the remains of Ray Davies in the backyard of 203 Waterloo Corner Road. After her death, Bunting continued to collect Suzanne's unemployment benefits and also stripped her home of belongings and sold them. On December the 10th, 1996, Suzanne's brother reported her to the police as missing. They contacted her last-known boyfriend, John Bunting, who, by this point, had redirected her mail to his home, making it look as though she'd moved there. When police attended, Bunting said Suzanne had been there, but had moved out, and told him that she didn't want to be contacted by anyone, not even her family. Given that her benefits were still being drawn out, and finding Bunting's story plausible, the police decided that Suzanne had, for whatever reason, decided to move away and break contact with her family, so the case was closed. Robert Bunting collected Suzanne's benefits between 1996 and 1999 and would provide various addresses to the benefits agency to make it seem like Suzanne was moving around, to make it appear to both them and the police, if they looked into the case, that she was still alive. By the end of 1996, Robert Wagner and Barry Lane had separated. This had occurred after Barry had again been accused of molesting a child in the local area, and the house they shared had been firebombed. This gave Wagner the chance to escape the relationship, and he then declared that he was not homosexual and began a relationship with a woman who we'll call Kate, who he soon became engaged to. Kate had children from a previous relationship, and Wagner quickly established himself as a father figure within the home. After several years of association with John Bunting, Robert Wagner was now fully committed to his cause and would enthusiastically espouse violent and hateful rhetoric about gay people, people of colour, and paedophiles to anyone who would listen. Unfortunately, in 1997, 19-year-old Michael Gardner would become the focus of both Bunting and Wagner's fury. He was homosexual and a friend of Kate, Wagner's now fiancée, and would regularly come round to play with her children. Wagner apparently tolerated Michael due to Kate, but Bunting instantly took a dislike to him, referring to him as, quote, the biggest homo. However, one incident sealed his fate. Specifically in early September 1997, whilst playing with the children, Michael grabbed hold of one of them and placed his hand over their mouth to stop them talking. It appears that this was a playful gesture, but was seen by Robert Wagner, who was incensed. Wagner apparently found this triggering, as he, as a child, had had a similar thing done to him whilst he was being sexually abused. Wagner contacted Bunting, and they both determined that Michael Gardner was a paedophile and deserved to die. To be clear, there's no evidence that Michael was a paedophile. On the evening of the 10th of September 1997, Michael Gardner was at the home he shared with his friend Nicole on Moffin Road in Adelaide. Nicole was away on business, so Robert Wagner and John Bunting knew he was alone. They drove to the property and ambushed Michael, forcing him into a vehicle where he was handcuffed, and then driven 60 miles to 3 Burdekin Avenue, Murray Bridge, a property that Bunting had moved to a few months before. Here, Michael was violently beaten by both men and tortured. His body, when it was eventually recovered, showed that it had been burnt all over his body, most likely with lit cigarettes, with the most severe burns being found to his scrotum. The torture appears to have been used primarily to extract his banking information from him. Eventually, after suffering hours of torture, Michael Gardner was taken into the garage adjoining the property and a noose placed around his neck. The end of the rope was placed over a beam in the ceiling and pulled so that Michael had to stand on his tiptoes to keep from strangling. Whilst fighting to stay upright, Michael had a phone held to his ear. He was told to tell the person on the end of the phone, a friend of his, he was going to move up north. This friend asked why, and the line went dead. Having put in place the first part of their plan to cover their tracks, John Bunting and Robert Wagner sat and watched the badly injured Michael struggle to stay upright. Eventually his strength failed him, he couldn't stay standing any longer, and Michael Gardner strangled to death. Wagner and Bunting then returned to Michael's home, which he shared with his friend Nicole, and they ransacked the place, including taking property belonging to her, and then forging a note apparently from Michael, apologising for the theft and saying he needed the money for his move up north. Over the next few weeks, Nicole got a number of phone calls from two men, one who claims to be a friend of Michael, and another who claims to be Michael himself. The supposed friend wanted Michael's wallet sent to him. This was because it had been left at the property by accident, and Bunting needed it to get access to the benefits payments. Nicole told this man that if Michael wanted this, he should come and get it himself. The man became abusive and hung up. On another occasion, a man called who claimed to be Michael. Nicole instantly knew this wasn't the voice of her friend. This man reiterated that Michael left, apparently to go and get a sex change. James Velasquez later stated that he was present during one of these phone calls, which were made by a man that had been convinced to do so by John Bunting. Michael Gardner was the first victim to end up in a barrel. This was a 44-gallon plastic barrel bought by John Bunting to store the bodies of his victims, which was then filled with hydrochloric acid to dissolve the remains. The barrel was stored in the shed as his property. A further 7 people end up in another 5 identical barrels, including someone we've already mentioned, Barry Lane, who had been murdered less than 2 months after Michael Gardner. As already stated, Barry Lane, by this point aged 42 years old, had separated from Robert Wagner in 1996. Like Wagner, he'd begun a relationship with a woman and proposed to her, and used this as evidence to tell people that he wasn't homosexual. However, it's been argued, and I would agree, that this was a calculated move by Barry to try to avoid the wrath of Bunting by pretending that he was no longer homosexual. In fact, looking at his behaviour, it appears that all of Barry's actions were calculated to try and stay on Bunting's good side. He provided evidence on other paedophiles, warned Elizabeth Harvey that her children were being abused, he even helped dispose of the body of Clinton. Due to his relationship with Robert Wagner breaking down, I think that Barry felt he'd lost an element of protection, and so needed to try and claim that he was not gay. However, the woman that Barry had begun a relationship with had children, and when the authorities became involved, the coupling ended. Barry then gave up the facade, and in April 1997, he invited a disturbed young man, 18-year-old Thomas Trevelyan, to live with him. Thomas had a history of mental health issues and was likely schizophrenic. He had intense fantasies about serving in the armed forces and would constantly dress in military uniforms and fatigues. He was known to be violent and often walk around brandishing a knife from spots to voices and noises he heard. It's recorded that Thomas had threatened Barry, and this was due to the latter's sexual advances. Although he was gay and a paedophile, Barry was killed, it would appear, primarily because he told several people about the murder of Clinton Trezise. He needed to be silenced before word got back to the police. On October the 17th, 1997, John Bunting and Robert Wagner broke into Barry Lane's property. Thomas Trevelyan was there, but he did not know whether he was involved in the planning of this murder. Barry was handcuffed and bound to a chair. He was then beaten into giving his debit card PIN number. He was then made to assist in covering up his own murder, and was forced to call his mother at around 11 p.m. This call was at the instigation of Bunting, and Barry was told to tell his mother he wanted nothing more to do with her, and that he was moving to Queensland and would not be coming back. Barry's mother heard Thomas Trevelyan shouting in the background, encouraging Barry to be as spiteful as possible to his mother. Barry was also forced to call his brother and convey the same story. With the men feeling confident that they covered their tracks, Barry was gagged with his head bound with tape. A pair of pliers were then used to crush his toes. Eventually, the three got bored of Barry's muffled screams, and he was strangled to death with a length of flex, apparently by Robert Wagner. His body was left on the floor of his home that the three men left. They returned several days later to clean up the scene. They also killed Barry's pet dogs and cats. His body was then moved and dismembered at a separate location, and eventually placed in the same acid-filled barrel as the remains of Michael Gardner, whose foot was cut off in order for the lid to be closed. Barry's disability benefits continued to be paid and were taken out of his account by Wagner. John Bunting took ownership of Barry Lane's truck and quickly swapped it for another vehicle, telling people he bought it from him. The police did look into the disappearance of Barry Lane, but the case quickly went cold. With Barry Lane dead, Thomas Trevelyan had served his purpose. His body was found by police on November the 5th, 1997, hanging from a tree in the town of Kersbrook in the Adelaide Hills. Due to his mental health difficulties, which included a history of self-harm and suicide attempts, Thomas's death was ruled a suicide. However, he'd been murdered. Bunting later told James Velasquez that because Thomas began to, quote, fuck up and go mental, he needed to be eliminated. Specifically, he'd begun telling everyone about the murder of Barry Lane, although many people thought this was part of his hallucinations. On the date of his death, John Bunting and Robert Wagner invited Thomas to go on a drive with them. In the vehicle was a box and a length of rope with a noose at one end. When they got to Kersbrook, Thomas was forced to stand on the box and the noose was placed around his neck. The box was then kicked away and Thomas Trevelyan strangled to death. Gavin Allen Porter was a 31-year-old man and another vulnerable male in this story. He was a paranoid schizophrenic who spent many years in and out of mental health facilities. He was also a drug addict, and after moving to Adelaide from Victoria in 1997, he soon met James Velasquez. The pair became friends, bonding over their use of heroin. In late 1997, Velasquez, his mother and his siblings moved to live with James Bunting at 3 Burdekin Avenue, Murray Bridge, and Gavin moved with them. Although it seems while he spent time during the day in the home, he slept outside in his car. Remember, this was a property with 2 dead bodies in a barrel in a shed in the garden. Why Bunting allowed Gavin to spend time in the property is unclear. He despised him and believed that he was a waste of space due to his drug addiction. Sometime in April 1998, John Bunting was pricked by a used needle left by Gavin on the sofa, and he was apoplectic and decided that he needed to die. On the date of his death, which was a few days after the needle incident, James Velasquez went to a drive-in movie, and when he came back, he saw John Bunting and Robert Wagner in Gavin's car, apparently keening up. Velasquez was then shown Gavin's body in the shed, which showed the imprint of a ligature mark on his neck. Bunting and Wagner had attacked Gavin when he was asleep in his car. He'd grabbed a screwdriver and managed to stab Bunting in the hand before being overpowered and strangled to death with the length of cord. Gavin's body lay on the shed floor for a number of days, whilst Bunting obtained another barrel filled with acid. With this accomplished, Velasquez helped Bunting put Gavin's body in the barrel, and it was sealed. Whilst disposing of Gavin, Bunting opened the first barrel, looked in and said, quote, "They're rotting very nicely." I now need to introduce the last person in this web of evil, a man named Mark Ray Hayden, who was born on December the 4th, 1958. Hayden was described as a shy and withdrawn child, whose mother used to abuse him both physically and mentally. He grew up socially isolated and had a few friends. He and John Bunting met in the late 1980s when they both attended a welding course, and they soon became inseparable. Hayden was privy to many conversations between John Bunting and Robert Wagner about their crimes, so he was fully aware of what these men were up to and how dangerous they were. Hayden married a woman called Elizabeth in February 1996, and after this point, he separated himself from the group. However, by 1998, and prior to the murder of the 8th victim, he'd reunited with his co-defendants. I don't have much information about Hayden's character as an adult, but, as you'll see, he was clearly as twisted as his associates. 21-year-old Troy Yude was the 8th victim of the group, and was the first murder which James Velasquez participated in. Troy Yude was, as mentioned earlier in this video, the half-brother of Velasquez, who'd apparently raped him when the pair were children. Early in his relationship with Bunting, Velasquez had told him about this abuse, and Bunting had responded by saying that Troy needed to die. However, despite this, as with other victims, Bunting and Troy had been associating for years, and he was, at the time of his death, living with Bunting and Velasquez. Why the group decided to kill Troy at this point is unknown, but this was clearly a pre-planned murder. The exact date of his death is unclear, but it was likely the 25th of August 1998. In preparation, Robert Wagner had come to 3 Burdekin Avenue, Murray Bridge, along with Mark Hayden, and they'd both armed themselves with hammers. They crept into the room where Troy was sleeping and attacked him, beating him, and when he woke up, he was quickly tied up and handcuffed and dragged into the bathroom. Velasquez said it was at this point that he was woken up and told that he needed to come as they were about to kill Troy. Velasquez went into the bathroom and found his badly beaten half-brother, now in the bathtub. Troy was further beaten and Bunting used pliers to crush his toes, whilst demanding that he repeat a string of numbers, words and sentences that were recorded and which would later be spliced together to create a message which would be played down the phone to others to explain his absence. This method of torture was also used to extract his bank information, including his PIN number. Troy was made to refer to the men who were about to murder him by various titles, including, quote, Lord and Sir. In particular, Bunting demanded to be called, quote, God, Master, and Chief Inspector. John Bunting went close to Troy's face and recounted the names of the people he'd murdered so far, no doubt wishing to see the terror in his latest victim's eyes, knowing he would now be added to that list. A rope was then placed around Troy's neck. A jackhammer was inserted into the rope to act as a twisting mechanism. The hammer was turned and the rope tightened, strangling Troy. It was then slackened and he caught his breath before the same thing happened again. This appears to have predominantly been done by Robert Wagner, whilst John Bunting stood over Troy, looking into his eyes and guessing off on his terror. By this point, Mark Hayden had apparently left the room, as did James Velasquez, but the latter returned and decided he needed to finish off his brother, so began to tighten the noose around his neck. It appears that Wagner also assisted, so it's unclear who actually killed Troy, but his death was determined, when his body was recovered, to have been due to strangulation. The next day, Bunting and Velasquez went to buy another barrel and returned to the property, and Troy's body was put inside, with acid then being poured over his remains. His legs were still sticking out, so Bunting took a knife, used his skills from working in a meat factory, and cut around Troy's ankle joint, removed his foot, and threw it into the barrel with the rest of his remains, before closing the lid. So by this point there were 3 barrels stored at the property, containing the bodies of 4 people, and the stench of decomposition was becoming more and more noticeable. Bunting and Wagner drew out Troy's unemployment benefits every fortnight, and Velasquez would lie to people about his half-brother's location, in order to convince them that he was still alive. Just breaking here for a moment. So far, John Bunting and his gang had murdered 8 people. Later, we'll come back to the issue of motive. Specifically claims that these killings were apparently a crusade to eradicate the world of paedophiles. However, the last 4 murders, in my opinion, show the absolute depravity of these men, dispel any noble cause being at the root of any of this horror. Victim 9, Fred Robert Brooks, was just 17 years old when he was murdered in September 1998. Like everyone else who had been murdered, he was known to at least one of the group, and in this case, it was Mark Hayden. Fred was his wife Elizabeth's nephew and had moved to the area in late 1997 in order to be close to his family. John Bunting became obsessed with the fact that Fred was, quote, touching up little girls. There's absolutely no evidence this is true, but Bunting kept repeating that Fred needed to die. In September 1998, Fred received notification that he'd been accepted to the Australian Air Force Cadets and was invited to a celebratory party with John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Velasquez on the 16th of September 1998. He promptly attended 3 Burdekin Avenue and walked straight into an ambush. Fred was beaten, handcuffed, tied up, and thumb cuffs were applied before he was forced into the bathtub where Troy had been murdered just weeks before. Remember, this is a kid who'd done nothing wrong, yet the torture he endured is absolutely sickening. Fred Brooks was interrogated by Bunting about him being, quote, dirty, because it was claimed he was a paedophile. In order to extract a confession and his banking information, Fred had lit cigarettes inserted to his ears and his nostrils. A lit spark was also placed into his urethra. His testicles were wired up to a mobile generator, which administered electric shocks, and bleach was also injected into his scrotum. As it became routine, Fred was forced to read out statements from phrases, which were tape recorded, which could be edited together to explain his disappearance. These phrases were disparaging about his family, and stated that he wanted nothing more to do with them. Like the other victims, pliers were used to crush Fred's toes. Again, Bunting stooped down so he could see eye to eye with Fred, and reeled off the names of the people he'd murdered, watching the hope drain from his face. A gag was then placed in his mouth, and tape wrapped around Fred's head. It's unclear how he died, but it appears he suffocated due to the gag in his mouth. Fred's body was placed in a barrel, but this time this was stored at 4 Blackham Crescent, where Mark Hayden lived with his wife Elizabeth. The other barrels had also been moved to this address, to give distance between John Bunting and his crimes. Mark Hayden was not involved in the murder of Fred Brooks, but knew what the barrels contained, and seemed to have no issue storing them. Again, the banking information was used to take money from Fred's account until the gang's eventual arrest. Less than 2 months later, the gang would kill again, This time they targeted a local man, 29-year-old Gary O'Dwyer. His story is extremely tragic. In his early 20s, Gary was involved in a serious car crash, which left him with lifelong disabilities. He received significant trauma to his head, which meant that he was left with significant cognitive impairments. He also walked with a pronounced limp due to the physical trauma of the crash. Due to this, he was unable to work and received a disability pension. He had no family to care for him, and so lived a solitary and lonely life at 23 Francis Street, Murray Bridge, which is a road which intersects with Burdekin Avenue, where the murder gang was based. Gary was frequently seen in the local area, just trying to get on with his life, and this included being spotted by John Bunting and Robert Wagner, who would, behind his back, mock him. Bunting stated that Gary was a, quote, fag and dirty, and that he needed to, quote, go to the clinic, which was a euphemism for murder. There's no evidence that Gary was gay, or a paedophile, or anything but a vulnerable man who Bunting saw as an easy target. And, whilst he espoused his usual hate to others, he tasked Velasquez with befriending Gary and gathering information on him, specifically how much money he had coming in and whether he had any family. So essentially, was he worth killing, and would anyone notice his absence? Velasquez followed the instructions and befriended their target. When it was found that Gary's murder was worth it, a quote-unquote party was arranged at his house on the 27th of October 1998. In attendance were James Velasquez, John Bunting, and Robert Wagner. They even brought beer to complete the illusion that Gary was going to spend time with his new friends. However, what Gary did not spot was the portable generator that had been brought to the property, the same one used to torture Fred Brooks. After only 20 minutes, and without warning, Robert Wagner grabbed Gary around the neck, began to strangle him. Bunting jumped in and said, quote, stop, you're killing him. However, this was simply telling Wagner to stop before he went too far, as they needed to extract information from this poor man. Gary was beaten and probes attached to various parts of his body, electric shocks applied, in order to extract his bank information, and to get him to record statements about the fact he was leaving the area and wanted no one to look for him. Velasquez held Gary down whilst the other two men took the lead. Gary was tortured for hours and eventually strangled to death with a piece of rope by either Bunting or Wagner. His body was placed into a newly bought barrel and transported to the property of Mark and Elizabeth Hayden, where it was stored along with the others. John Bunting then stripped all of Gary's possessions from his home, killing his furniture, which was either sold or divvied up by the murderers. Gary's sofa was later found in Mark Hayden's living room. Bunting told the neighbours that Gary had had some trouble with some local Aboriginals and had left the area due to fear for his life and would return when the heat died down. Between October 1998 and February 1999, Gary O'Dwyer's disability pension was drawn out repeatedly by the men. Victim 11, the penultimate victim, was the crime that would eventually lead to the downfall of the group, and again was an individual who had no link to any alleged sexual offences and who was extremely vulnerable. This person was 37-year-old Elizabeth Hayden, wife of Mark Hayden. Elizabeth was a woman with significant physical and intellectual difficulties. She was also overweight, which seemed to really annoy Bunting, with him referring to her as disgusting and a waste of flesh. He would, behind Mark Hayden's back, refer to his wife as a, quote, whore and lowlife. The reason for Elizabeth's murder was primarily to silence a potential witness, as Mark Hayden had told his wife about the murders, so she needed to be eliminated. This murder shows the depravity and heartlessness of Mark Hayden, as it appears that he was fully aware of the plan to murder his wife. On the 21st November 1998, Mark Hayden and Elizabeth were visited by John Bunting and Robert Wagner at their home at 4 Blacken Crescent. Eventually, Mark Hayden left the property. It seems he was fine with his wife being murdered, he just didn't want to see it happen. After he'd left, Elizabeth was attacked by Bunting and Wagner. She was dragged into the bathroom, handcuffed, and a sock forced into her mouth secured with tape around her head. She was then beaten and tortured, before eventually being strangled to death by either Wagner or Bunting, using a noose that had been placed around her neck. Her body was then taken to the shed at the back of the property and placed in an acid-filled barrel, which joined the other 5 already stored there. As I said, not much is known about Mark Hayden, but it's clear that he was just as sick as his associates, due to firstly appearing to know that his wife was going to be murdered and allowing this to happen. But when he returns to the property, he was shown his wife's remains in the barrel. When he saw her body, he simply laughed. Elizabeth's murder would be the beginning of the end. Unlike the other victims, her absence was noticed quickly, and within 3 days of her murder, Her brother reported her as a missing person to the police, and they began an investigation. On the 26th of November 1998, they attended 4 Blackham Crescent and spoke to Mark Hayden about his wife's disappearance. He was edgy, but the police had no reasons to search his property at that point. Little did they know they were standing less than 50 metres from barrels containing 7 dead bodies. They left, but their involvement signified the beginning of the end, but not before one final murder. The presence of the police so soon after the murder of Elizabeth Hayden spooked all those involved, and they realised they needed to move the barrels to a new location. Initially, the 6 barrels were loaded onto the back of Mark Hayden's Land Cruiser and driven to the property of a couple that John Bunting knew in Snowtown. We shall call them Stephen and Julie. This is the first mention of the location that's become synonymous with this case. Snowtown is a quiet town, 145 kilometres or around 90 miles north of Adelaide, and only has a population of around 400 people. It's isolated. Before these crimes, most people had never heard of it. However, quickly, Bunting was asked by Stephen and Julie to move the Land Cruiser off their property due to the stench coming from the vehicle, and it was then, in January 1999, the group found an old disused bank in the town, and it was quickly decided that this property, this out-of-the-way town, would be the perfect place to store the bodies of those already killed, but also those who would be murdered in the future. Mark Hayden and John Bunting co-signed the lease for the bank, and, along with Robert Wagner and James Velasquez, the 6 barrels were moved into the area, which used to be the bank's vault. However, advisable detail is that the Land Cruiser, although now empty, was left parked on the property of Stephen and Julie. Some of the barrels were opened, and several of the bodies cut into smaller pieces. This was likely because they had not dissolved as expected, but we'll return to this later. With the bodies out the way, no doubt the men felt as though they were likely to get away with their crimes, and so they started planning more murders. The 12th and last victim was 24-year-old David Johnson, the stepbrother of James Velasquez. John Bunting never liked David, primarily because he was fastidious about his cleanliness and appearance. But instead of seeing this as a young man who just wished to take care of himself, Bunting described this as evidence of him being a, quote, faggot. Bunting told Velasquez that David needed to die, and they came up with a plan to lure him to the bank. Specifically, Velasquez was to offer his stepbrother a computer for sale, and offer to take him to see it. However, instead, he'll be taken to the bank and murdered. Velasquez agreed to the plan, and having piqued his stepbrother's interest in potentially buying a computer, on the 9th of May 1999, he drove his vehicle to the bank in Snowtown, with David following behind in his own car. The pair entered through the side door of the bank, and as soon as they walked in, David Johnson was ambushed. Robert Wagner grabbed David around the neck, and Bunting placed him in handcuffs. Bunting told David that everything was going to be okay. He just wanted to ask him some questions, and that he would be able to leave when he gave the answers, which would be in around 30 minutes to an hour. David was beaten, and flesh cut from his body using a Stanley knife in order to obtain his bank card PIN number. He was also forced to record pre-prepared statements, which would be left on answer phone messages to his friends and family, to cover the murderer's tracks. The other men then left to try and take out money with the bank card, leaving Bunting and David alone. David, knowing that he was about to die, made a last-ditch attempt at freedom and charged at his captor. Johnson managed to break several of Bunting's ribs, but with his hands restrained, he was at a disadvantage, and eventually Bunting got the upper hand and was able to remove David's belt, which he then used to strangle him to death. The men then set about to, quote, slice and dice, and dismembered the body of David Johnson. However, then, as if these men were not evil enough, Velasquez later claimed that he had seen Bunting and Wagner cooking part of David's flesh that had been cut away earlier and eating it. David's remains were placed in one of the barrels already in the vault, meaning that there were now 6 barrels with the remains of 8 people in them. No doubt the plan was to have a steady stream of victims lured into the bank and essentially have a conveyor belt of murder and dismemberment, but the group's days were numbered. They just didn't realise it yet. By the time of the murder of David Johnson in May 1999, a major police investigation was already underway due to the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden. Police who spoke to her husband, Mark Hayden, in November 1998 were unconvinced by his story and noticed how nervous he was. When they returned later to make further inquiries, they were told by neighbours about a Land Cruiser being used to transport barrels, which stank. The police looked into the case more thoroughly and in particular missing person reports in the city of Adelaide. It transpired that they were already suspicious about the men. As early as July 1998, police had become aware that Robert Wagner was withdrawing money from the account of Barry Lane, with him being caught on camera doing this. This was despite no one having seen Barry for months. Missing person reports were compiled for disappearances in the Adelaide area, and diligent police work established connections between Robert Wagner and 5 missing person cases. These were Clinton Trezise, Susan Allen, Barry Lane, Elizabeth Hayden, and Ray Davies. This was due to his personal links to these individuals, but also unusual activity on the bank accounts of some of these people, with evidence suggesting people, including him, had been taking money out long after these people had last been seen. Soon, the connection between Wagner and Bunting was established. The evidence led them to believe that Elizabeth Hayden had likely come to harm, and her disappearance was considered a major crime, which meant the police had more money and scope to act. This led to police being given the authority to tap the phones of Robert Wagner and John Bunting, which then led them to identify Mark Hayden and James Velasquez as being part of the group. On May the 20th, 1999, Mark Hayden was followed by police who travelled to Snowtown. As the officers were driving along, they spotted the Land Cruiser they'd been looking for, parked outside the property of Stephen and Julie. Despite the vehicle being empty, the officers noted the smell of decomposition, and when they knocked on the door, the conversation with the couple unlocked the key to everything. Stephen and Julie told the police that the Land Cruiser had been parked outside their home with barrels in it. Because they smelled so bad, they told their friend, John Bunting, to move them, and they knew that he and his friends had rented the abandoned bank in town. The police descended in force from the bank. They entered the property, progressed to the vault. They walked through plastic sheeting, which had been attached to the door frame to try to conceal the smell of death, and into a room with 6 barrels. The smell of decomposition was overpowering. Officers opened each barrel in turn and filmed the contents, and were able to establish, to their horror, that as opposed to the 5 missing people they were concerned about, they were staring at the remains of 8 people. The police acted quickly. The next day, the 21st of May 1999, John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Hayden were all arrested and taken into custody. In the same afternoon, all 3 were charged with a single count of murder of a person unknown. Inevitably, this was a holding charge, while the horror of this case was being unravelled. James Velasquez was arrested separately on the 23rd of May 1999 and immediately confessed. He spent the next 6 days telling the police everything, every murder and every detail. This allowed the police to recover the bodies of Suzanne Allen and Ray Davies at Bunting's former home at 203 Waterloo Corner Road. He was also able to correct them that the death of Thomas Trevelyan, who had been found hanging, was not a suicide, but another murder. In total, James Velasquez gave the police details related to 12 murders. Bodies recovered were examined. Despite thinking he was very smart, as John Bunting had used hydrochloric acid as opposed to sulfuric acid, the bodies had not dissolved entirely and were mostly mummified, which meant identification of the remains from DNA, fingerprints, distinguishing features, etc. was much easier. It also meant that the catalogue of wounds to each victim could be documented, which enabled the confession of James Velasquez to be corroborated, essentially sealing the fate of all the men. Based on this evidence, John Bunting, Mark Hayden, and Robert Wagner were charged with 11 murders based on joint enterprise, which is a concept whereby, in this case, regardless of who actually killed each victim, they were all involved in creating the circumstances where they knew a person would be murdered, and so they were all equally culpable for the outcome. John Bunting was also charged separately for the murder of Clinton Trezise. James Velasquez confessed to and was charged with direct involvement in the murders of his stepbrother David Johnson, his half-brother Troy Yude, as well as Gary O'Dwyer and Fred Brooks. All men were remanded into custody to await their day in court. James Velasquez pleaded guilty to the 4 murders he'd confessed to at the first opportunity. On June the 21st, 2001, Velasquez, now aged 21 years old, appeared at the South Australian Supreme Court for sentence. He was sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment, with a minimum tariff of 26 years. This sentence was his exchange for his full cooperation with the legal proceedings of his co-defendants, including giving evidence against them. In return, James Velasquez was being given some hope of release, despite the horrific things he'd done, although this would only be after serving longer than he'd been alive by this point in prison. On August 13, 2002, John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Hayden pleaded not guilty to all charges and were remanded to prison to await their trial date. Quickly, the case against Mark Hayden fell apart. They simply didn't have enough evidence to convict him of murder of any of the victims. I think it's clear that he was more involved than the court were able to prove, so he was eventually convicted of 7 counts of assisting in the murders of 7 of the victims. This primarily related to him transporting and storing their bodies. Mark Hayden was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment, with him having to serve 18 years of this for his role in the Snowtown murders. On September 27, 2002, Robert Wagner admitted to 3 murders, those of Barry Lane, Fred Brooks, and David Johnson. This was prior to the start of his trial in October of that year. I've no doubt this was tactical. I believe that Wagner was hoping that by admitting some of his crimes, he would get a sentence like Velasquez, which would mean that he might see the light of day again. He was mistaken. John Bunting and Robert Wagner's trial started at the South Australian Supreme Court on October 22, 2002. The star witness against both men was James Velasquez. The trial lasted almost a year, and on the 8th of September 2003, the jury delivered their verdicts. As I've already stated, the jury were unable to reach a verdict on the murder of Suzanne Allen, as they could not rule out that her death was due to natural causes. However, John Bunting and Robert Wagner were both convicted of the murders of Ray Davies, Michael Gardner, Barry Lane, Thomas Trevelyan, Gavin Porter, Troy Yude, Fred Brooks, Gary O'Dwyer, Elizabeth Hayden, and David Johnson. In addition, John Bunting was convicted of the 1992 murder of Clint Trezise. These verdicts meant that these 2 men are amongst the most prolific serial killers in Australian history. On October 29, 2003, both men appeared before Justice Brian Martin for sentence. Justice Martin identified John Bunting as the ringleader and addressed both men saying, quote, "Your crimes were premeditated and a number of them involved considerable planning and preparation. I'm satisfied that both of you derived pleasure from the physical act of killing and the violence and torture that preceded some of the killings. It's not an exaggeration to say you were in the business of killing for pleasure." He continued, quote, "The evidence presented during the murder trial has drawn me to the conclusion that both of you are incapable of true rehabilitation." He then sentenced them. Both John Bunting and Robert Wagner were sentenced to life imprisonment with no parole period, so they will die behind bars. As he was being led away, Robert Wagner said, quote, "Pedophiles were doing terrible things to children. The authorities didn't do anything about it. I decided to take action. I took that action. Thank you." I found very little information about the men's time in prison. James Velasquez, now aged 43, is eligible for parole in 2025. Mark Hayden, currently 64 years old, was denied parole in 2017 and again in 2021 and remains behind bars. But his prison term expires in May 2024 and he will automatically be released at this time. With regards to John Bunting, now aged 57 years old, he appears to have accepted that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Robert Wagner is currently 51 years old and continues to try and gain his freedom. In 2019, a letter was published that he'd written to the Court of Appeal, asking for a parole period to be set in his case in order to give him some chance of release. I'll read out the letter, but note the tone and content and the manipulation in Wagner's words. He writes, quote, "I'm a father of a 21-year-old son. I've been in custody since he was 18 months old and would very much like the chance to spend time with him in the community. I believe that by having a non-parole period set, this would greatly assist my mental well-being. Even if the non-parole period was lengthy, just having a date would be beneficial for me. I'm willing to undergo a psych evaluation/assessment should this be required. My behaviour in prison has been reasonably good. I'm currently a circle worker, which is a trusted position. I'm eager to continue with my good behaviour so I can progress through the system. As part of this process, having a non-parole period set would be beneficial. I've done almost 20 years in custody, and I hope that this can be taken into consideration. I pled guilty to 3 counts of murder, which I hope to also be taken into consideration with this request. This bizarre note clearly shows that Robert Wagner does not accept the gravity of his crimes. In a lot of these murders, it seems as though it's difficult to determine who actually ended the victims' lives, but it does appear that Wagner was the one, in the majority of cases, who committed the actual murders. Him using the issue of being a parent to his son is manipulative and ridiculous. In cases where someone commits a serious offence and then bleats about the fact they won't be able to see their children, etc., my response is, well, you didn't think about that at the time, did you? Robert Wagner's son was alive at the time that he murdered David Johnson, so he must have gone home after this and held his son in the same hands that recently held a saw, which had been used to cut up a man's body. Also, he destroyed families through his actions. Why should he be given special treatment given what he's done? I'm aware that he's not asking for release now, but the fact he thinks he ever deserves to be free again is laughable. The Court of Appeal agreed and rejected Wagner's request, and he remains in prison today, where he belongs. This is a fascinating, horrific and complex case. I mention the men involved, but will predominantly focus on John Bunting, the spider at the centre of the web. As a starting point, I think the most important thing in this case is to dispel any notion that the actions of anyone involved was underpinned by anything other than self-interest. Robert Wagner's claim that the group's actions were somehow a response to the police not locking up paedophiles is ridiculous and clearly an attempt to make him and his merry band of murderers seem noble when nothing could be further from the truth. To reinforce this point, it should be noted that UK forensic psychiatrist Kevin Howes, who has worked at Broadmoor Maximum Security Hospital, expressed his opinion that John Bunting was a man who lacked emotion or capacity to empathise with any of his victims, and that he fit the profile of a sadistic psychopath. Specifically, a person who enjoyed the act of torture and murdering others, whilst feeling no remorse for his actions. I think this is spot on, and it's also the underpinning profile of Robert Wagner, and likely Mark Hayden. I don't believe that it relates to James Velasquez, who I'll talk about separately. However, the key thing about these comments is that each man was likely a psychopath. They had no ability to empathise or care about others, and therefore it doesn't correlate that their actions were motivated by concern for anyone else, especially not the welfare of children. The claim about this being about eradicating paedophiles is just not backed up by the evidence. Only one of the victims, Barry Lane, was actually a convicted paedophile. Also, with Barry Lane, if the motivation was eradicating paedophiles, then it seems strange that he'd be allowed to live for around 6 years before his eventual death, especially given that he was, from what I've read, quite a danger to children and more than likely to reoffend. Instead, he was kept alive because it was useful to John Bunting, and murdered to silence him, again a motive to benefit Bunting. Also, whilst 2 others have either committed offences against children or suspected of doing so, that's it. So this means for 9 victims, there was no link to paedophilia. So I think you can see Mark Hayden's claim in court is bullshit. Instead, they were men motivated by hate, the love of killing, power and money, and would torture and murder anyone in a heartbeat. In order to understand the real motives, we need to begin by looking at John Bunting, who's at the centre of this case. As already stated, he claimed he was sexually abused when he was a child, and this, he says, occurred when he was 8 years old, and on one occasion. Some research I've read raises some level of scepticism about his claim that Bunting potentially trying to portray himself as a victim of paedophilia to justify the murders, which, as I've already stated, doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I would tend to agree with this. However, I think more than likely, in line with so many other serial killers, Bunting was subjected to more general abuse, likely acts of violence and neglect in the family home. This led him to grow up without any empathy, remorse or compassion for others, as well as extreme violent tendencies. Potentially this did include the sexual assault he claims, but I think, if it did occur, it compounded the effect of wider issues of abuse in his childhood, which are not documented. Bunting's escape from this abuse, again like so many other serial killers, was to wield control over other living things, making himself feel powerful at a time when he likely felt utterly powerless. So he began to torture animals, beginning with insects, and then progressing to killing and skinning cats and dogs. I think that Bunting enjoyed this, and found that he got a sick thrill from having the power of life and death over something living, watching life go out of their eyes, and knowing he had caused that. In terms of his views, I think that primarily John Bunting was homophobic. He despised gay people, and, as with others who hold discriminatory views of homosexuals, he equated this sexual orientation with paedophilia. So to be gay was to be a paedophile, and to be a paedophile meant you were gay. Whether these views were linked to the alleged sexual abuse he suffered is unclear, but more likely it's a reflection of the social situation at the time. During the 1970s and 1980s, the decades Bunting grew up in, the state of Queensland was ruled by the Conservative National Party, headed by John Bellelke-Peterson. In order to regain re-election, the topic of homophobia was used to spread fear, whilst also linking it to paedophilia. Coupled to this, you had the worldwide AIDS crisis of the 1980s, which resulted in the vilification of homosexuals across the globe. Returning to Queensland, consensual sexual acts between men was only officially decriminalised in 1991, so I think the environment that Bunting grew up in was a key catalyst to his hatred of homosexuals. A person who's homophobic often has other prejudices, as their mindset is inclined to try to elevate their own sense of importance or uniqueness by looking down on other people, and so they'll often look for differences between themselves and others in order to vilify them. So, people who are homophobic often, in my experience, have racist or sexist views, etc. This is where I think Bunting's obsession with Hitler and neo-Nazism is important. Whilst those of the Jewish faith made up the majority of those murdered during the Nazi regime, other categories of so-called undesirables were also exterminated, including the mentally and physically infirm and homosexuals. I think Bunting, given his obsession with this period of history, likely knew this, and this information, coupled with his association with people who likely shared his views, strengthened his hatred of homosexuals, but also allowed him to consider others, including the mentally ill, physically infirm, to be inferior, and therefore perfect to use and abuse, and then exterminate. So you have a man who has no remorse or empathy for others, a tendency towards acts of violence, a desire to wield power over living things, who had an underlying hatred of homosexuals, and an obsession with a regime which eliminated those considered impure on an industrial scale. I think, like others who I've covered who had an admiration for the Nazi regime, John Bunting desired that level of power, not only the ability to eliminate people at will, but also to direct others to do this on his behalf. I have no doubt that Bunting had been having fantasies about killing people long before his first murder in 1992, and he likely wished to emulate his idol, and, in order to match even a small fraction of the horror that characterized the Holocaust, he needed recruits, people who could assist him in acts of violence on the scale that he wanted. Bunting's recruitment methods and his place within the group reminds me of a cult. As I said in a recent video regarding Michael Wayne Ryan, leaders of cults are often psychopathic and motivated by power and control. They recruit followers who are vulnerable for whatever reason, and replace that feeling of powerlessness with a sense of purpose, which meets their own ends. This was simply an extension of how Bunting operates in his day-to-day life. He targeted those weaker than him, who he could dominate, for example marrying a woman who had the mental age of a child. Using this template, I have no doubt that Bunting had an ability to sniff out vulnerability, to identify people who he could manipulate, and he came across Robert Wagner, a man who, unfortunately, had been abused for years at the hands of Barry Lane, a predatory paedophile, with no one apparently trying to do anything to help him escape. I imagine that Wagner felt extremely angry, abandoned and lost. John Bunting then appears in his life, and turns this completely on its head. He is in fact better than these people. They are scum, and, if you join me, I'll show you how powerful you can be. Wagner's hatred of paedophiles was, to a great extent, understandable due to the years of abuse he suffered, but it's also likely that he equated homosexuality with paedophilia. However, the abuse he suffered as a child likely meant, as with Bunting, he grew up with no empathy or remorse for his behaviour. Bunting simply nurtured something that was already there. Bunting and Wagner attended neo-Nazi rallies together, and I imagine this was part of Wagner's indoctrination to solidify his hatred of homosexuals, but also to see other types of people in society as being inferior and therefore worthy of abuse and murder. From the account of James Velasquez, it's clear that Bunting would often speak to his followers about his hatred of paedophiles and homosexuals, although in his mind, these were the same things, and I imagine he was a charismatic speaker who would lie and manipulate in order to continually reinforce his doctrine to his followers. One of these people was Mark Hayden, who, again, was a prime target due to his history of abuse, and I think the ability of Bunting to manipulate and brainwash others is shown by the fact that this man not only allowed the group to kill his wife, but when he saw her body, he simply laughed. His behaviour, in my mind, indicates a psychopathic personality, but it may also be that he had extreme cognitive difficulties, having an IQ so low that he could not grasp the seriousness of his situation. I don't have enough information to make a judgment, but it's clear that Mark Hayden was someone Bunting saw as someone he could use for his own ends. Another prime example was James Velasquez, a child who had had a horrific upbringing, who was desperate for love and attention and acceptance of someone who was not going to abuse him. However, John Bunting continued this cycle and turned this child's vulnerability to his advantage, again filling his head with hate, so that he would be complicit in the horrors to come. Like everyone else in Bunting's life, James Velasquez was only there to be of use to him. I think the murder of Troy Eude is significant. This was not, in my opinion, born out of any concern for James Velasquez or an act of retribution for his suffering. No, I think that when Bunting heard about Troy abusing Velasquez as a child, he instantly heard homosexual in his head, and therefore he wanted him to die because of his own prejudices, but it was also a test. Troy could easily have been killed without the input of Velasquez, but he was woken and told to come and join in. I think that Bunting, and likely Wagner, wanted to see what Velasquez would do. If he participated, he also had blood on his hands and was one of them. If he did not, he would have been eliminated. Velasquez did participate, but I think, had he not, his name would have been on the list of victims in this case. However, even if the plan had been originally to kill homosexuals, it became clear as time progressed that murder was used to gain access to money, eliminate witnesses, and eliminate those that Bunting considered inferior for any number of reasons, or who simply pissed him off. The issue of money doesn't seem to be highlighted much in what I've read, but I think it is a relevant factor. The group pocketed around 90,000 Australian dollars in benefits payments from their victims, which today is around 170,000 Australian dollars, which is equivalent to about £93,000 or around $115,000. Whilst this may not have been the primary motive of this spree, it seems to be at the heart of at least one murder, that of Gary O'Dwyer, with James Velasquez being tasked with finding out whether killing him was worth it financially. This again simply shows the complete lack of humanity regarding John Bunting. Everyone in his life was to be used and abused, whether this was to get off on the power of killing them or to line his own pockets. And this is the essence of this group. It was all about John Bunting. I can envisage Bunting imagining himself on a throne as a king, or a god, or a dictator, who, when he had the urge to kill, points his finger at someone and ordered their murder, with his minions carrying out his orders without question. This was the most important motivation of all, directing others to do his bidding, as well as the torture and murders themselves, which was something that Bunting enjoyed. It reinforced his sense of power, allowed him to live out his fancies of superiority, him going so far as to get his victims, in their last moments, to essentially grovel at his feet, whilst he looked into their eyes as they took their last breath. His claims about paedophilia and homosexuality, I think predominantly, especially towards the end, simply used to get his followers into a further, so they would carry out his orders. No doubt, if he hadn't been stopped, the bank vault in Snowtown would have been piled high floor to ceiling with barrels, the output of a production line of murder. However, I think James Velasquez was different. Despite his involvement in this horrifying case, I have a great deal of sympathy for him. His whole life from his childhood to his incarceration was characterized by abuse, going from one predator to another. It doesn't appear from what I've read that Velasquez ever really stood a chance. To be very clear, difficult childhood of any degree does not excuse taking the life of others, but I hope that his full confession, guilty plea, and his acceptance of his punishment are indicators of some level of remorse for his actions, and that, when he's eventually released, he tries to do some good with the rest of his life. This case has taken me ages to research and put together. In the quiet streets of Oak Ridge Heights, a picturesque suburban enclave, the Blackwood residence stood as a beacon of domestic bliss. To the casual observer, Zephyr and Lorelei Blackwood epitomized the American dream. Successful careers, a beautifully maintained craftsman home, and a marriage that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. Their neighbors often remarked on the couple's apparent devotion to one another, evidenced by their frequent dinner parties and synchronized jogging routines. But beneath the polished veneer of their seemingly perfect life, the Blackwoods harbored a secret that would ultimately lead to their undoing. For the past 2 years, Zephyr and Lorelei had been active participants in a local swinging community, a lifestyle choice that promised to add excitement and passion to their decade-long marriage. At first, their foray into the world of consensual non-monogamy seemed to reinvigorate their relationship. They spoke of feeling closer, more honest, and more in love than ever before. However, as with many things that glitter, the reality of their chosen path was far more complex and fraught with danger than either could have anticipated. What began as a mutual adventure in sexual exploration would eventually expose deep-seated insecurities and long-buried resentments. This is the story of how a couple's search for excitement and fulfillment led to jealousy, rage, and murder. Zephyr Blackwood was a rising star in the tech scene. With his sharp intellect and innovative ideas, he had quickly climbed the corporate ladder at a leading software company. Colleagues described him as driven, charismatic, and occasionally intense. Standing tall in a runner's physique, Zephyr turned heads wherever he went. Despite his professional success, those closest to him noted a persistent undercurrent of insecurity, stemming from a childhood marked by his parents' messy divorce and his father's subsequent absence. Lorelei Blackwood was Zephyr's perfect complement. A talented freelance graphic designer, she balanced her husband's Type A personality with her more laid-back, creative approach to life. With her warm eyes, infectious laugh, and curves that defied her dedication to yoga, Lorelei was the kind of person who made friends easily and kept them for life. Growing up in a large, boisterous family, she valued connection and openness above all else. The couple met during their senior year at the university. Zephyr was immediately drawn to Lorelei's free spirit and artistic talent, while she found herself captivated by his ambition and hidden vulnerability. Their whirlwind romance culminated in a beachside proposal just 6 months after graduation, and they married a year later in a lavish ceremony that was the talk of their social circle. For the first 7 years of their marriage, Zephyr and Lorelei seemed to have it all. They traveled extensively, built successful careers, and created a home that was the envy of their friends. However, as they approached their mid-30s, a sense of restlessness began to creep into their relationship. The passion that had once burned so brightly had dimmed to a comfortable but uninspiring glow. It was Lorelei who first broached the subject of exploring new avenues in their sex life. Always the more sexually adventurous of the two, she suggested they attend a few workshops on tantric practices and BDSM. Zephyr, eager to please his wife and reignite their spark, agreed enthusiastically. These workshops opened up new channels of communication between the couple, and they found themselves discussing fantasies and desires they had never before shared. It was during one of these conversations that the topic of swinging first arose. Lorelei had read about it online and was intrigued by the idea of consensual non-monogamy. Zephyr, initially hesitant, warmed to the concept as Lorelei painted a picture of increased intimacy and shared adventures. After months of discussion, research, and soul-searching, the Blackwoods decided to take the plunge. They created profiles on swinger websites, attended a few meet-and-greet events, and finally participated in their first full swap with another couple. The experience was exhilarating, and for a time it seemed to breathe new life into their marriage. Little did they know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The Blackwoods' entry into the world of swinging was marked by a mix of nervous excitement and cautious optimism. Their first experience, a soft swap with a couple they met through a reputable swinger website, exceeded their expectations. The evening was filled with laughter, flirtation, and a level of sexual tension that neither Zephyr nor Lorelei had experienced in years. As they drove home, hands intertwined, they couldn't stop grinning at each other, already planning their next encounter. Over the next few months, Zephyr and Lorelei became regulars in the swinging scene. They attended parties at upscale clubs, participated in intimate gatherings at private homes, and even organized a few events of their own. Their social circle expanded rapidly, filled with like-minded couples who shared their desire for excitement and sexual exploration. Lorelei, in particular, thrived in this new environment. Her natural charisma and open-mindedness made her a favorite among their swinging friends. She reveled in the attention she received from both men and women, and her confidence soared. Zephyr, too, seemed to flourish initially. He enjoyed the ego boost that came from other women finding him attractive, and he took pride in having a wife that others desired. The couple's sex life, both with others and between themselves, reached new heights of passion and intensity. They found themselves experimenting with fantasies and kinks they had never before considered. Lorelei would often joke that they were having more sex now than they did in their first year of marriage. As they became more comfortable with the lifestyle, the Blackwoods began to form deeper connections with some of the couples they met. They particularly clicked with Ether and Nova Sterling, a pair of free-spirited artists who had been in the swinging scene for years. The four of them often got together for dinner and drinks, which would invariably lead to steamy encounters that left everyone satisfied. However, as the months wore on, subtle changes began to occur in the dynamics of Zephyr and Lorelei's relationship. While Lorelei continued to embrace the lifestyle with enthusiasm, Zephyr started to show signs of discomfort. He began to notice the way other men looked at his wife, the ease with which she flirted and connected with their swinging partners. What had once been a source of pride now stirred uncomfortable feelings in the pit of his stomach. Zephyr found himself paying closer attention to Lorelei's interactions, especially with Ether Sterling. He couldn't help but notice the lingering touches, the inside jokes, the way Lorelai's eyes seemed to light up in Ether's presence. Rational thought told him that this was all part of the game, that Lorelai always came home with him at the end of the night. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts and fueled his growing insecurity. Despite his misgivings, Zephyr kept his feelings to himself. He didn't want to disappoint Lorelai or appear weak in front of their new friends. Instead, he threw himself into the lifestyle with renewed vigor, as if trying to prove something to himself and others. He initiated more encounters, suggested wilder scenarios, and pushed his boundaries further than he was truly comfortable with. Lorelai, caught up in the excitement and new experiences, failed to notice the subtle changes in her husband's behavior. She interpreted his increased enthusiasm as a sign that he was enjoying the lifestyle as much as she was. In her mind, swinging had brought them closer together, opening up new avenues of communication and shared experiences. As their second anniversary in the lifestyle approached, the Blackwoods were seen as a success story in their swinging circle. They were attractive, fun, and seemingly more in love than ever. But beneath the surface, the seeds of discord had been sown. The very lifestyle that had reinvigorated their marriage was now silently driving a wedge between them, setting the stage for the tragic events that were to come. The first signs of trouble in the Blackwoods' seemingly perfect arrangement appeared subtly at first. Zephyr began to make offhand comments about cutting back on their swinging activities, suggesting they focus more on their own relationship. Lorelai, interpreting this as a passing mood, gently brushed off his concerns and encouraged him to embrace the freedom and excitement they had discovered. As weeks passed, Zephyr's jealousy grew more pronounced. He started to question Lorelai about her interactions with other men, particularly Ether Sterling. His inquiries, initially casual, became more frequent and intense, where once he had enjoyed watching Lorelai with other partners, he now found himself averting his eyes, a knot forming in his stomach. Lorelai, for her part, struggled to understand the change in her husband. She repeatedly assured him of her love and commitment, emphasizing that their adventures in swinging were purely physical and did not threaten their emotional bond. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears as Zephyr's insecurities deepened. The tension between them began to spill over into their daily lives. Arguments that started about swinging quickly devolved into broader accusations and recriminations. Zephyr would bring up past grievances, questioning Lorelai's fidelity even before they entered the lifestyle. Lorelai, frustrated by what she saw as Zephyr's irrational behavior, found herself becoming defensive and withdrawn. Their professional lives started to suffer as well. Zephyr, usually laser-focused at work, became distracted and irritable. His colleagues noticed the change, whispering about possible troubles at home. Lorelai, whose work required creativity and a positive outlook, found it increasingly difficult to meet deadlines and satisfy clients. Despite the growing discord, Lorelai was reluctant to give up the lifestyle that had brought her so much joy and self-discovery. She suggested they take a break from group activities and focus on one-on-one encounters, hoping this would ease Zephyr's jealousy. But even this compromise led to conflict, with Zephyr accusing Lorelai of trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. As their arguments intensified, the Blackwoods' facade of domestic bliss began to crumble. In a last-ditch effort to salvage their marriage, Zephyr suggested they seek counseling. Lorelai agreed, hoping that a professional could help them navigate the complex emotions stirred up by their foray into non-monogamy. However, finding a therapist who was both qualified and non-judgmental about their lifestyle proved challenging, further adding to their frustration. As the date of an upcoming swinger party hosted by the Sterlings approached, the tension in the Blackwood household reached a fever pitch. Lorelai was determined to attend, seeing it as an opportunity to reconnect with friends and reaffirm their place in the community. Zephyr, conflicted and resentful, reluctantly agreed to go, setting the stage for the tragic events that would unfold. The evening of May 15th dawned warm and clear, a perfect spring day. As twilight approached, the Blackwoods began preparing for the Sterlings' party, with an undercurrent of tension thrumming between them. Lorelai hummed to herself as she applied her makeup, choosing a slinky black dress that accentuated her curves. Zephyr, watching her from the doorway, felt a familiar mix of desire and dread coiling in his stomach. They arrived at the Sterlings' upscale loft just as the party was getting started. The spacious apartment was bathed in soft, colorful lights, with sensual music pulsing through hidden speakers. Couples and singles mingled, drinks in hand, the air thick with anticipation and pheromones. Nova Sterling, resplendent in a shimmering gold jumpsuit, greeted them warmly. Zephyr couldn't help but notice how her embrace with Lorelei lingered, the two women exchanging knowing smiles. Ether appeared moments later, clapping Zephyr on the back before placing a gentle kiss on Lorelei's cheek. The knot in Zephyr's stomach tightened. As the night progressed, Zephyr found himself growing increasingly agitated. He watched as Lorelei flitted from group to group, her laughter carrying across the room. She seemed to be in her element, radiating confidence and sensuality. In contrast, Zephyr felt awkward and out of place, nursing the same drink for hours as he observed the interactions around him. The party began to shift gears as couples started to pair off or form small groups, disappearing into the various playrooms the Sterlings had set up. Zephyr lost sight of Lorelei for a while, his anxiety spiking as he searched the crowded loft. He finally spotted her in deep conversation with Ether, their heads close together as they spoke in low tones. Unable to contain himself any longer, Zephyr approached the pair. He caught the tail end of their conversation, something about meeting up later in the week for coffee. Lorelei's eyes widened slightly as she noticed Zephyr, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she composed herself. Zephyr, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, suggested it was time to leave. Lorelei protested, arguing that the night hasn't ended. Their disagreement, though conducted in hushed tones, drew curious glances from nearby guests. Ether, sensing the tension, tried to smooth things over, but his intervention only seemed to irritate Zephyr further. As the argument threatened to escalate, Nova appeared, smoothly inserting herself into the situation. With practiced ease, she guided Zephyr and Lorelei to a quiet corner of the loft, encouraging them to take a moment to cool off. She offered them water and gentle words of advice, reminding them of the community's emphasis on open communication and mutual respect. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Nova's intervention had diffused the situation. Zephyr took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm himself. Lorelei reached out, squeezing his hand in a conciliatory gesture. But as they stood to rejoin the party, Zephyr caught sight of Ether watching them intently. Something in the other man's gaze, concern, pity, or perhaps something else entirely, caused Zephyr's tenuous control to snap. In a cold, clipped voice, he announced that he and Lorelei were leaving. This time, Lorelei didn't argue. She could see the storm brewing behind Zephyr's eyes and knew that staying would only lead to a scene. Apologizing profusely to Nova and avoiding Ether's gaze, Lorelei allowed Zephyr to lead her out of the loft. The drive home was fraught with silence, the tension between them so thick it was almost suffocating. Lorelei stared out the window, her earlier vivacity replaced by a wary exhaustion. Zephyr gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his jaw clenched as he navigated the nearly empty streets. As they pulled into their driveway, neither made a move to exit the car immediately. For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them. Finally, Lorelei turned to Zephyr, her voice soft but firm as she said, "We need to talk about this. We can't go on like this." Zephyr nodded stiffly, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Without a word, he got out of the car and headed for the front door. Lorelei followed, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the conversation to come would likely change their lives forever. Neither of them could have predicted just how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. As soon as the front door closed behind them, the facade of calm they had maintained in public crumbled. Zephyr rounded on Lorelei, his face contorted with a mix of anger and pain. The words tumbled out of him in a torrent of accusations and grievances, all the doubts and fears he had been harboring for months finally finding voice. He raged about her behavior at the party, the way she had flirted openly with Ether and others. He brought up past encounters, dissecting them with jealous scrutiny, finding evidence of betrayal in the smallest gestures and glances. His voice rose as he spoke of the coffee plans he had overheard, convinced it was proof of an ongoing affair. Lorelei, initially stunned by the ferocity of Zephyr's outburst, found her own anger rising to meet his. She defended herself vehemently, reminding him that openness and honesty had always been the foundation of their relationship and their foray into swinging. She accused him of hypocrisy, pointing out his own enthusiastic participation in their lifestyle choice until recently. Their argument echoed through the house, a cacophony of hurt feelings and misunderstandings. Lorelei tried to reason with Zephyr, to make him see that his jealousy was unfounded, but her words seemed to bounce off him without making an impact. In frustration, she brought up his own dalliances within the swinging community, asking why it was acceptable for him, but not for her. This only served to enrage Zephyr further. He advanced on Lorelei, his tall frame looming over her as he backed her into a corner of their living room. Lorelei, feeling trapped and increasingly frightened by Zephyr's uncharacteristic aggression, attempted to push past him. In that moment, something in Zephyr snapped. As Lorelei tried to move away, he grabbed her arms, his fingers digging into her skin with bruising force. Lorelei cried out in pain and surprise, her eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at the man she had loved for over a decade, suddenly unrecognizable in his fury. She struggled against his grip, her own anger giving way to fear as she realized how out of control the situation had become. Zephyr, lost in a haze of jealousy and rage, didn't seem to hear her pleas to let go. In her desperation to break free, Lorelei's hand caught Zephyr across the face, her nails leaving angry red scratches on his cheek. The physical contact seemed to push Zephyr over the edge. With a roar of inarticulate rage, he shoved Lorelei hard. She stumbled backwards, her heel catching on the edge of the area rug. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her arms flailing as she tried to catch herself. But there was nothing to break her fall, and her head struck the corner of the solid oak coffee table with a sickening thud. The sound seemed to snap Zephyr out of his frenzy. He stood frozen, watching in horror as Lorelei crumpled to the floor, a small pool of blood beginning to form beneath her head. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Zephyr's ragged breathing. For several long moments, he remained rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then, as if moving through molasses, he stumbled towards Lorelei's motionless form. He fell to his knees beside her, hands shaking as he reached out to touch her. Her skin was still warm, but as he frantically searched for a pulse, he found nothing. The reality of the situation crashed over Zephyr like a tidal wave. He had done the unthinkable. In a moment of uncontrolled anger, he had taken the life of the woman he loved. As the enormity of his actions began to sink in, Zephyr let out a howl of anguish, cradling Lorelei's lifeless body in his arms as tears streamed down his face. In the quiet suburban street outside, a neighbor who had been walking his dog paused, startled by the sound of despair emanating from the Blackwood residence. It was a cry that would haunt the neighborhood for years to come, marking the moment when a loving marriage ended in unimaginable tragedy. The early morning calm of Oak Ridge Heights was shattered by the arrival of police cruisers and an ambulance, their lights painting the tree-lined street in alternating flashes of red and blue. Neighbors emerged from their homes as they watched the unfolding scene, with a mix of curiosity and dread. Detective Rhiannon Frost, a veteran of Homicide Division, arrived on the scene shortly after the first responders. As she ducked under the crime scene tape, she was struck by the contrast between the manicured exterior of the Blackwood home and the chaos that awaited inside. The living room, once a showcase of tasteful decor, now bore the unmistakable signs of violence. The coffee table was askew. A lamp lay shattered on the floor, and at the center of it all was the body of Lorelei Blackwood, partially covered by a sheet. Forensic technicians moved around the room with practiced efficiency, photographing and collecting evidence. Frost's keen eyes took in every detail. Dr. Kai Nakamura briefed her on their initial findings. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head, likely from impact with the corner of the coffee table. Signs of a struggle were evident, including bruising on the victim's arms and defensive wounds on her hands. As Nakamura spoke, Frost's attention was drawn to the figure of Zephyr Blackwood, seated on a dining room chair, his head in his hands. He was still wearing the clothes from the previous night's party, now rumpled and stained. A uniformed officer stood nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the distraught husband. Frost approached Zephyr, her experienced gaze noting his scratched cheek and the smears of blood on his shirt. In a voice hoarse from crying, he began to speak, weaving a tale of a party, an argument, and a tragic accident. As she listened, Frost's instincts told her there was more to the story than Zephyr was revealing. His account seemed rehearsed, lacking the raw emotion one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife. She made a mental note to dig deeper into the couple's background and recent activities. Outside, the neighbors huddled in small groups, exchanging shocked whispers and speculative glances. The Blackwoods had always seemed so happy, so perfect. What could have gone so terribly wrong? In the days following Lorelei Blackwood's death, Detective Frost and her team worked tirelessly to piece together the events that led to that fateful night. Their investigation began to reveal a complex web of relationships and hidden tensions that lay beneath the surface of the Blackwoods' seemingly idyllic life. Interviews with friends and colleagues painted a picture of a couple who had recently embraced the swinging lifestyle. While many expressed surprise at this revelation, a select few provided valuable insights into the dynamics of the Blackwoods' open marriage. Nova Sterling, in particular, proved to be a crucial witness, recounting the argument she had witnessed at the party and the obvious tension between Zephyr and Lorelei. As the detectives delved deeper, they uncovered a trail of digital evidence that shed light on the couple's private life. Text messages and emails revealed Zephyr's growing jealousy and Lorelei's increasing frustration with his behavior. Particularly damning was a series of messages between Lorelei and Ether Sterling, discussing Zephyr's recent mood swings and Lorelei's concerns about the future of her marriage. Forensic analysis of the crime scene yielded more damning evidence against Zephyr. The angle and force of Lorelei's fatal injury were inconsistent with a simple fall. DNA evidence under Lorelei's fingernails matched Zephyr's, corroborating the signs of a struggle. Furthermore, toxicology reports showed that while Lorelei had a modest amount of alcohol in her system, Zephyr's blood alcohol level had been significantly higher, suggesting he may have been more impaired than he initially claimed. As the investigation progressed, Detective Frost brought Zephyr in for a series of intense interrogations. Under the relentless pressure of questioning, his carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. Inconsistencies in his story emerged, and his demeanor shifted from grief-stricken widow to a man consumed by guilt and fear. In a dramatic turn of events, Ether Sterling came forward with additional information. He revealed that Lorelei had confided in him about her plans to leave Zephyr, citing his increasingly controlling and jealous behavior. This revelation provided a possible motive for Zephyr's actions, suggesting that the murder may have been premeditated rather than a heat-of-the-moment crime of passion. The investigation also uncovered financial records indicating that Zephyr had recently inquired about the couple's life insurance policies, adding another layer of suspicion to his actions. Friends reported that he had been under increasing stress at work, with rumors of potential layoffs circulating in his company. As the evidence mounted, the prosecution began to build a strong case against Zephyr Blackwood. The narrative that emerged was one of a man who, faced with the prospect of losing both his wife and his carefully cultivated image of success, had lashed out in a jealous rage with tragic consequences. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the city and beyond, promising to expose the hidden world of suburban swingers and the devastating consequences of jealousy unleashed. Prosecutor Vivian Zhao opened the proceedings with a powerful statement, painting a vivid picture of a marriage destroyed by jealousy and a woman's life cut tragically short. She promised to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Zephyr Blackwood had murdered his wife in a fit of rage, driven by his inability to control her and his fear of losing her. The defense countered with a narrative of a tragic accident, the result of a loving marriage strained by lifestyle choices that neither party was fully prepared for. Holloway sought to portray Zephyr as a devoted husband, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Nova and Ether Sterling provided crucial testimony about the Blackwoods' involvement in the swinging community and the visible tension between them on the night of Lorelei's death. Their accounts were both illuminating and scandalous, causing a stir in the courtroom and generating salacious headlines. Forensic experts presented detailed analyses of the crime scene, with Dr. Kai Nakamura delivering damning testimony about the nature of Lorelei's injuries. His assertion that the fatal wound was inconsistent with an accidental fall dealt a significant blow to the defense's case. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Zephyr Blackwood himself took the stand. Under Holloway's careful guidance, he presented himself as a man deeply in love with his wife, who had agreed to explore swinging to please her. He spoke of his growing discomfort with the lifestyle and his fears that he was losing Lorelei to it. However, under Zhao's relentless cross-examination, Zephyr's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. She confronted him with text messages, emails, and witness statements that contradicted his version of events. As the questioning intensified, Zephyr's composure slipped, revealing flashes of the anger and jealousy that had led to that fatal night. The gallery watched in rapt attention as Zephyr struggled to maintain his story under the prosecution's onslaught. His voice cracked as he recounted the final argument with Lorelei, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might break down and confess. But he managed to hold himself together, sticking to his claim of a tragic accident to the end. As the trial neared its conclusion, both the prosecution and defense delivered impassioned closing arguments. Joe urged the jury to see through Zephyr's lies and hold him accountable for the brutal act that had ended Lorelei's life. Holloway, in turn, pleaded for understanding, asking the jury to consider the complex emotions and circumstances that had led to this tragedy. With the evidence presented and arguments made, the case was turned over to the jury. As they filed out to begin deliberations, a tense hush fell over the courtroom. The fate of Zephyr Blackwood now rested in their hands. In the end, the jury took less than 6 hours to reach a verdict. Zephyr Blackwood was found guilty of second-degree murder, a decision that sent shockwaves through the community and brought a measure of closure to Lorelei's grieving family and friends. The judge, citing the brutal nature of the crime and Zephyr's lack of remorse, sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison. The aftermath of the trial left an indelible mark on the community. The case had exposed the hidden world of suburban swingers, leading to heated debates about morality, trust, and the nature of modern relationships. Some couples who had been part of the lifestyle quietly distanced themselves, while others became vocal advocates for ethical non-monogamy, emphasizing the importance of communication and consent. In the end, the tragic story of Zephyr and Lorelei Blackwood served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the strongest relationships can be undone by jealousy, mistrust, and uncontrolled anger. Their story would be remembered not just as a sensational crime, but as a complex human tragedy born from the eternal struggle between love, desire, and the need for control. At the heart of this story are two couples. Isabella and Russell Hawthorne, both in their early 50s, had been fixtures of the community for over 2 decades. They were the couple everyone looked up to. Successful, well-respected, and seemingly happily married, their home was often the center of neighborhood gatherings. Just 3 houses down, the newly wedded Zara and Eric Donovan had recently moved in. Both in their mid-20s, they brought a youthful energy to the street that had long been dominated by older families and retirees. Their arrival was met with curiosity and warmth by their neighbors, particularly the Hawthornes. Little did anyone know that the lives of these 4 individuals would soon become entangled in a web of desire, obsession, and murder. What began as a daring experiment in sexual exploration would spiral into a nightmare that would leave one dead, one behind bars, and 2 others grappling with the consequences of their choices. This is the story of how a seemingly innocent proposition led to a brutal crime that would be splashed across national headlines and forever change the lives of those involved. It's a cautionary tale of the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary-seeming individuals and the devastating consequences of stepping outside societal norms. Isabella Hawthorne had always been the golden girl. Growing up in Seattle, she was the captain of her high school cheerleading squad, prom queen and valedictorian. But Isabella was more than just a pretty face. She had a sharp mind and boundless ambition. She met Russell Hawthorne during her sophomore year at the University of Washington. Russell, 2 years her senior, was the star quarterback with a bright future ahead of him. Their courtship was the stuff of campus legend, the perfect couple that everyone envied. They married shortly after Isabella's graduation, with dreams of conquering the world together. Russell's promising football career was cut short by a knee injury in his first year as a professional player. He pivoted to sports management, quickly climbing the corporate ladder. Isabella, meanwhile, pursued a career in marketing, her creativity and drive making her a rising star in the field. Their move coincided with the birth of their daughter, Lily. They threw themselves into parenthood and their careers with equal fervor. From the outside, they seemed to have it all: successful careers, a beautiful home, and a loving family. But as the years went by, cracks began to appear in their perfect facade. Russell's work kept him away from home for longer stretches, and he began to put on weight, losing the athletic physique that had first attracted Isabella. For her part, Isabella found herself increasingly restless, With Lily away at college, the house felt empty, and her job no longer provided the satisfaction it once did. Isabella began to wonder if this was all there was to life. She started yoga classes and joined a book club, searching for something to fill the growing void she felt. She found herself envying the young couples she saw, with their passionate embraces and carefree laughter. When was the last time she and Russell had shared such moments? Russell, oblivious to his wife's discontent, continued his routine of long hours at the office, followed by evenings in front of the TV with a beer in hand. Their conversations became perfunctory, limited to discussions about bills, home maintenance, and occasional updates about Lily. As her 50th birthday approached, Isabella felt a growing sense of panic. Was this how she would spend the rest of her life? The woman who had once been voted most likely to succeed now felt trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. It was in this state of mind that Isabella first laid eyes on Eric Donovan. Young, handsome, with a lean swimmer's build, Eric represented everything that was missing from Isabella's life: excitement, passion, and the promise of adventure. For the first time in years, Isabella felt a stirring of desire. As she watched Eric and his young wife Zara move into the neighborhood, an idea began to form in her mind. An idea that would change everything. Zara Donovan, born Zara Khalil, was the daughter of Lebanese immigrants who had settled in Portland 2 decades earlier. Growing up, she had always felt caught between two worlds: the traditional values of her parents and the liberal, free-spirited culture of the Pacific Northwest. With her olive skin, Zara stood out in a city that was predominantly white. From a young age, Zara showed a passion for art. Her parents, while supportive, always emphasized the importance of a practical career. As a compromise, Zara studied graphic design at Portland State University, finding a way to merge her creative instincts with a marketable skill. It was during her final year at PSU that Zara met Eric Donovan. She was working on her thesis project at a local coffee shop when Eric, a barista there, struck up a conversation about her sketches. Eric, with his easy charm and boyish good looks, immediately captured Zara's attention. Eric had grown up in a small town in rural Oregon, the youngest of 4 boys in a working-class family. He'd moved to Portland 3 years earlier, drawn by the city's vibrant art scene and progressive culture. While he worked as a barista to pay the bills, his true passion was photography. His Instagram account, filled with moody black and white portraits in stark urban landscapes, had a modest but growing following. Their romance was a whirlwind. Within weeks of their first meeting, Eric and Zara were inseparable. They spent their days exploring Portland's hidden gems, secret gardens, underground art galleries, hole-in-the-wall music venues. Eric introduced Zara to urban exploration, and she in turn taught him about Lebanese cuisine and culture. To Zara, Eric represented freedom and self-expression. He encouraged her to pursue her art without compromise, to break free from the expectations of her family and society. With Eric, Zara felt seen and understood in a way she never had before. For Eric, Zara was his muse and his anchor. Her quiet strength and unwavering support gave him the confidence to pursue his photography more seriously. He began to book small gigs, weddings, local band promotional shots, even a few magazine spreads. Their decision to get married came as a surprise to many who knew them. Both sets of parents expressed concern about the speed of their relationship, but Eric and Zara were convinced they had found their soulmates. They had a small ceremony in a sculpture garden, surrounded by their closest friends and family. The move was a practical decision. As freelancers, they needed a space that could serve as both home and studio. The quiet suburb offered affordable housing, close enough to the city for work opportunities. They saw it as the perfect place to start their life together, envisioning lazy Sunday mornings in their backyard and cozy evenings planning their future. Little did they know that their new neighborhood held secrets and temptations that would test the strength of their young love. As they unpacked boxes in their new home, neither Eric nor Zara could have imagined the turmoil that lay ahead or the devastating consequences their choices would have. The annual summer block party was a tradition that dated back decades. Every year on the last Saturday of August, Sycamore Lane would transform into a bustling fairground of sorts. Neighbors would bring out grills, coolers full of drinks, and folding tables laden with potluck dishes. Children would run around with water guns and bubble wands, while adults caught up on neighborhood gossip and sipped cold beers. This year's party held a special significance for the residents of Sycamore Lane, which was the official welcome for the Donovans. the street's newest additions. Isabella Hawthorne, as the unofficial social director of the neighborhood, had taken it upon herself to ensure that Zara and Eric felt welcomed. As the afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the street, Isabella made her way to the Donovans, who were standing somewhat awkwardly at the edge of the gathering. "Isabella, you look lovely," Russell called out as she walked past, her sundress floating around her legs. She flashed him a smile, but her eyes were already fixed on Eric. "Eric and Zara, welcome to the neighborhood," Isabella said warmly, air-kissing Zara's cheeks and letting her hand linger perhaps a moment too long on Eric's arm. "We're so glad you could join us." The conversation flowed easily, lubricated by the fruity sangria Isabella had brought along. Zara found herself drawn into a discussion about local art galleries with some of the other neighbors, while Eric and Isabella drifted towards the Hawthorns' front yard. "You have a beautiful home," Eric commented, his eyes roving over the house. Isabella beamed with pride. "Why, thank you," she replied. "You should see the inside. We recently renovated the master bathroom. Perhaps I could give you a tour sometime. Get you some ideas for your own place?" The flirtatious undertone in Isabella's voice was unmistakable. Eric, slightly taken aback but not displeased, felt a flush creep up his neck. Before he could respond, Russell appeared, clapping a hand on Eric's shoulder. "Hope my wife isn't talking your ear off, son." Russell chuckled. Isabella shot him a look that mixed annoyance and affection. "Actually, she was just offering to show me your renovation," Eric said, his voice slightly strained. As the evening wore on, the two couples found themselves gravitating towards each other. Zara, charmed by Russell's dad jokes and genuine interest in her artwork, found herself relaxing for the first time since moving in. Isabella, meanwhile, hung on Eric's every word as he described his photography projects. By the time the party wound down, seeds had been planted. Seeds of attraction, curiosity, and temptation that would soon grow into something none of them could have anticipated. It was a week after the block party that Isabella first broached the subject with Russell. They were in bed, the TV droning in the background, when Isabella turned to her husband with a mischievous glint in her eye. Isabella broached the subject with Russell one night as they lay in bed. Her voice was casual, but there was an undercurrent of excitement as she asked if he had ever considered spicing up their love life. Russell, half asleep, mumbled incoherently at first. Isabella pressed on, clarifying that she meant specifically in the bedroom. This caught Russell's attention and he became suddenly alert. Cautiously, Russell asked what exactly she had in mind. Isabella took a deep breath before suggesting they try swapping partners with another couple. The silence that followed her proposal was deafening. Russell stared at his wife, trying to determine if she was serious. As he realized she was, a mix of emotions played across his face: shock, intrigue, and a hint of arousal. Over the next few days, the Hawthorns had numerous discussions about Isabella's proposition. Russell, initially hesitant, found himself warming to the idea. The thought of being with a younger woman stirred something in him he thought had long since died. It was Isabella who finally suggested the Donovans. "They're young, attractive, and new to the area," she reasoned. "They might be open to something like this." Approaching the younger couple proved to be a delicate matter. It was at a neighborhood barbecue that Isabella, emboldened by several glasses of wine, pulled Zara aside. The conversation was awkward at first, with Isabella dancing around the subject, but once the proposition was laid out, Zara's reaction surprised her. Instead of outrage or disgust, there was curiosity in the younger woman's eyes. The evening of the swap arrived with a mix of nervous energy and anticipation. The Hawthorns had suggested using their home, citing their finished basement as a perfect, private setting. As Zara and Eric walked up the driveway hand in hand, Zara could feel her heart pounding in her chest. "Are we really doing this?" He squeezed her hand reassuringly, but she could see the apprehension in his eyes as well. Isabella greeted them at the door, her smile a little too bright, her laugh a little too loud. The forced casualness of the situation was palpable as they made small talk over glasses of expensive red wine. Russell busied himself with the stereo, filling the room with soft jazz in an attempt to ease the tension. After what seemed like an eternity of awkward conversation, Isabella finally stood up. "So," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "shall we?" They had agreed beforehand on the pairings, Isabella with Eric, Russell with Zara. As they split off, Zara couldn't help but glance back at Eric, a moment of uncertainty passing between them. But then Eric disappeared down the hallway with Isabella, and Zara found herself alone with Russell. Russell led Zara to the guest bedroom, his hand gentle on the small of her back. Despite his earlier bravado, he felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. It had been years since he'd been with anyone other than Isabella. Zara, sensing his hesitation, took the initiative. She reached up and kissed him softly, then more passionately. Russell responded, his hands exploring her young, firm body with growing confidence. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Isabella was living out the fantasies she'd been harboring since she first laid eyes on Eric. His youthful energy and enthusiasm more than made up for any lack of experience. Isabella felt desired, beautiful, alive in a way she hadn't in years. Eric, for his part, was intoxicated by Isabella's confidence and sensuality. As the encounters reached their climax, a series of emotions washed over each participant. Excitement, pleasure, guilt, and an unexpected emptiness all mingled together in a confusing cocktail. Afterwards, as they all reconvened in the living room, an awkward silence fell over the group. The reality of what they had done seemed to hit them all at once. Zara couldn't meet Eric's eyes, focusing instead on smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her dress. Russell cleared his throat several times, but couldn't seem to find any words. Only Isabella seemed truly at ease, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It was Eric who finally broke the silence. "Well," he said, his attempt at a casual tone falling flat. "That was something." The tension broke and nervous laughter filled the room. They made stilted small talk for a few more minutes before the Donovans made their excuses and left. As Zara and Eric walked home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, they were unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred in their relationships. Back in the Hawthorne house, Isabella hummed to herself as she cleaned up, already thinking about the next time. Russell watched her, a nagging feeling of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. None of them realized that this night was just the beginning, the first step down a path that would lead to obsession, betrayal, and ultimately, tragedy. In the days following the swap, life seemed to return to normal, but beneath the surface, changes were brewing, particularly in Eric Donovan. Eric found himself unable to stop thinking about Isabella. The encounter had awakened something in him, a hunger he'd never experienced before. He began to find excuses to be outside when he knew Isabella would be leaving for work. He'd wave, trying to appear casual, but his eyes would linger on her long after she'd driven away. Zara noticed the change in her husband almost immediately. Eric seemed distracted, often lost in thought. When she tried to initiate intimacy, he was either too tired or not in the mood. Their once passionate lovemaking became infrequent and mechanical. One afternoon, Zara came home early from a client meeting to find Eric's photography workspace in disarray. As she began to tidy up, she noticed something odd. Hidden beneath a stack of prints was a folder filled with photos of Isabella. Some were clearly taken from a distance, capturing Isabella gardening, getting her mail, or walking to her car. Others were more intimate, zoomed-in shots through windows, Isabella in various states of undress. Zara felt her stomach churn. This wasn't just a harmless crush or the after effects of their encounter. This was something much more sinister. Meanwhile, Isabella had begun to notice Eric's increased presence in her daily life. At first, she was flattered by the attention, even reciprocating with flirtatious glances and accidental touches when they'd run into each other. But as the days wore on, Eric's behavior became more erratic and intense. He began sending her messages at all hours, alternating between passionate declarations of love and angry accusations when she didn't respond quickly enough. Isabella tried to let him down gently, explaining that their encounter was a one-time thing, but Eric refused to accept it. One night, Isabella woke to the sound of something hitting her bedroom window. Peering out, she saw Eric standing in her front yard, a handful of pebbles in his hand. His eyes, wild and unfocused, locked onto hers. "I can't live without you, Isabella," he called out, his voice breaking. "We're meant to be together." Isabella quickly closed the curtains, her heart racing. She woke Russell, who grumbled as he went to confront Eric. By the time Russell made it outside, Eric had disappeared into the night, leaving only a crumpled bouquet of flowers on the front step. As Isabella lay awake that night, she realized with growing horror that her exciting sexual experiment had unleashed something dark and dangerous. She had no idea how right she was, or how tragic the consequences would be. Over the next few weeks, Eric's behavior spiraled further out of control. His obsession with Isabella consumed every aspect of his life. He neglected his photography business, spending hours stalking Isabella's social media accounts and driving by her house. Zara watched helplessly as her husband transformed into someone she barely recognized. Isabella, for her part, vacillated between fear and a perverse excitement. Part of her was terrified of Eric's growing instability, but another part, a part she was ashamed to admit existed, was thrilled by his obsessive attention. It made her feel desirable, powerful in a way she hadn't in years. The situation came to a head one afternoon when Isabella returned home to find Eric sitting in her living room. "How did you get in here?" she gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Eric smiled, a cold, unsettling expression that sent chills down Isabella's spine. "You gave me a key, remember? For watering the plants when you were on vacation." Isabella's mind raced. That had been months ago, before the swap, before everything had gone wrong. She should have asked for it back. Why hadn't she asked for it back? Eric stood, moving towards her with predatory grace. "We need to talk, Isabella," he said, his voice low and intense. "About us, about our future together." Isabella backed away, fumbling for her phone. "There is no us, Eric," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to leave." But Eric kept advancing, his eyes wild with a mixture of love and madness. "You don't mean that," he insisted. "I know you feel what I feel. We're destined to be together, Isabella. I won't let anyone come between us." As Eric reached for her, Isabella let out a scream. The sound seemed to snap Eric out of his trance. He blinked, looking around as if seeing the room for the first time. Without another word, he brushed past Isabella and out the front door. Shaking, Isabella collapsed onto the couch. She knew she should call the police, but what would she say? That she'd willingly slept with her young neighbor, and now he was stalking her. The thought of the scandal, of everyone knowing what she'd done, was unbearable. Little did Isabella know, her silence would have devastating consequences. For in his twisted mind, Eric took her failure to report him as a sign of her secret love, and he was determined to eliminate any obstacles standing in their way, no matter the cost. The tension that had been building for weeks finally erupted on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Isabella was alone in her house, Russell having left for a golf game with friends. She was in the kitchen, mindlessly flipping through a magazine when she heard the back door open. Isabella called out with a trembling voice, asking if it was Eric. There was no response, only the sound of footsteps moving through the house. Her heart racing, Isabella grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it out in front of her like a shield. When Eric appeared in the doorway, his eyes were glazed and unfocused, and he reeked of alcohol. He slurred that he had seen Russell drive away, declaring that now they could be together as they were supposed to be. Isabella pleaded with Eric, telling him he needed help and that this wasn't right, but she couldn't finish her sentence. Eric wasn't listening. He lunged forward, trying to grab Isabella. She shrieked and swung the knife wildly, connecting with Eric's arm and drawing blood. The sight of his own blood seemed to enrage Eric further. He roared and insulted her and charged again. In the ensuing struggle, the knife clattered to the floor. Eric's hands found Isabella's throat, squeezing with terrifying strength. Isabella clawed at his face, gasping for air as her vision began to darken around the edges. In desperation, she brought her knee up sharply, connecting with Eric's groin. The blow caused him to double over in pain, releasing his grip on her throat. Isabella scrambled away, her fingers closing around the handle of the fallen knife. As Eric straightened up, his face contorted with rage, Isabella acted on pure instinct. She thrust the knife forward, feeling it sink into Eric's chest. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Eric looked down at the knife protruding from his body, a look of surprise replacing the anger on his face. Then slowly he crumpled to the floor. Isabella stared at Eric's still form, the reality of what she'd done crashing over her. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone and dialed 911. The quiet of the community was shattered by the wail of sirens as police cars and an ambulance converged on the Hawthorne residence. Neighbors poured out onto their front lawns, watching in shock as paramedics rushed into the house, only to emerge shortly after, shaking their heads grimly. Detective Liam Reeves, a veteran of the Portland Police Department, arrived on the scene to find a distraught Isabella Hawthorne being questioned by officers. Her hands and clothes were stained with blood, her eyes wild with shock and fear. As Reeves approached, he overheard snippets of Isabella's statement. She was saying that Eric had attacked her, that she had no choice, and expressing shock and disbelief at what she had done. Reeves took charge of the scene, ordering a thorough search of the house and surrounding area. While crime scene technicians combed through the kitchen, photographing the bloody knife and the signs of struggle, Reeves turned his attention to the neighbors. Zara Donovan stood at the edge of the police tape, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. Reeves approached her gently, introducing himself as Detective Reeves and confirming that the victim was her husband. Zara nodded mutely, tears streaming down her face. When Reeves pressed her about when she had last seen Eric, Zara managed to choke out that it had been that morning. She explained that Eric had said he was going for a walk, but her voice trailed off as she struggled to process the situation. Unable to continue, she broke down sobbing. Reeves made a note in his pad before moving on to question other neighbors. As he gathered more information, a story began to emerge of a quiet neighborhood rocked by an unthinkable crime. As the body of Eric Donovan was wheeled out on a gurney, covered by a sheet, Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than a simple home invasion gone wrong. The look in Isabella Hawthorne's eyes, a mixture of relief and guilt, told him that unraveling the truth would be a complex and delicate process. In the days following Eric's death, Detective Reeves dove deep into the lives of both the Hawthornes and the Donovans. What he uncovered was a tangled web of secrets and lies that painted a very different picture from the initial reports of a random break-in. Interviews with neighbors revealed whispers of an illicit affair between Isabella and Eric. Cell phone records showed an overwhelming number of calls and messages from Eric to Isabella in the weeks leading up to the incident, many of which had gone unanswered. But it was the discovery of Eric's photography studio that blew the case wide open. Hidden among his professional equipment, detectives found a camera with a high-powered zoom lens and memory cards filled with hundreds of photos of Isabella, many taken without her knowledge. When confronted with this evidence, Zara broke down. Through tears, she revealed the truth about the partner swap and the subsequent obsession that had gripped her husband. She spoke of Eric's erratic behavior, his neglect of their marriage, and her own fears about his mental state. Isabella, faced with the mounting evidence, finally confessed to the full story. She admitted to the affair and the stalking, but maintained that the final confrontation had been self-defense. Russell, devastated by his wife's infidelity, nonetheless stood by her side throughout the ordeal. As Reeves pieced together the events that led to that fatal Sunday afternoon, he was struck by the tragedy of it all. What had begun as a misguided attempt to spice up a stagnant marriage had spiraled into an obsession that cost a young man his life and forever changed the lives of all involved. The case, once thought to be a straightforward home invasion, was now revealed to be a complex tale of desire, betrayal, and deadly obsession. The prosecution painted Isabella as a bored housewife who initiated an affair with a younger man, then killed him to keep her indiscretion secret. They emphasized the premeditated nature of her actions, pointing to the convenient absence of her husband on the day of the killing. The defense, led by high-profile attorney Simone Jeffries, argued passionately that Isabella was a victim of stalking and harassment who acted in self-defense. They presented evidence of Eric's obsessive behavior and called expert witnesses to testify about the psychological impact of stalking on victims. Zara's testimony proved to be a turning point in the trial. Her emotional account of Eric's descent into obsession and her own fear for Isabella's safety swayed many jurors. "She's not the monster they're making her out to be," Zara said through tears. "Eric, he wasn't himself at the end. What happened is a tragedy, but Isabella was as much a victim as anyone." In his closing arguments, the prosecutor urged the jury not to be swayed by emotion. "The facts are clear," he insisted. "Mrs. Hawthorne made a series of choices that led to this tragic outcome. She must be held accountable." Simone Jeffries, in her rebuttal, appealed to the jury's sense of empathy. "Put yourself in Isabella's shoes," she implored. Terrified, alone, confronted by a man who had been stalking her for weeks, she did what anyone would do. She fought for her life. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. The fate of Isabella Hawthorne and the final judgment on this suburban tragedy now rested in their hands. Isabella Hawthorne was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. As Isabella was led away from the courtroom, the impact of the tragedy on all involved was palpable. Russell Hawthorne, his face haggard from the stress of the trial, watched his wife disappear through the courtroom doors. Despite the revelations of her infidelity, he had stood by her throughout the ordeal. Now he faced the prospect of years alone, grappling with the consequences of their ill-fated experiment. Sarah Donovan, widowed and alone, retreated from public life. The trauma of losing Eric and the public exposure of their private lives left deep scars. She threw herself into her art, producing a series of haunting paintings that would later be hailed as a powerful exploration of grief and betrayal. The residents struggled to come to terms with the events that had shattered their peaceful community. The Hawthorne and Donovan houses stood empty, constant reminders of the tragedy that had unfolded. Some neighbors moved away, unable to bear the memories. Those who stayed found their trust in one another irrevocably altered. Donald and Violet Dawson were the golden couple of Riverview. They moved into their elegant two-story house on Maple Street 5 years ago, quickly becoming popular in the tight-knit community. Donald's wit and charm made him a favorite at neighborhood gatherings, while Violet's warm smile and artistic talent endeared her to everyone she met. Together they hosted barbecues, attended charity events, and were often seen jogging together in the mornings, embodying the image of marital bliss. Donald's career as a financial analyst was thriving. He had a keen eye for investments and was climbing the corporate ladder with impressive speed. His colleagues admired his work ethic and sharp mind, often turning to him for advice on financial matters. Violet, on the other hand, ran a successful freelance graphic design business from home. Her designs were in high demand, and she had a loyal client base that appreciated her creativity and attention to detail. Their social circle included other young professionals and couples who often praised their relationship. They seemed to complement each other perfectly. Donald was the outgoing, ambitious partner, while Violet provided a nurturing and supportive presence. They had no children, but they doted on their golden retriever, Max, treating him like their own child. To anyone looking in from the outside, Donald and Violet had it all. But as the months turned into years, small cracks began to appear in their perfect facade. The first signs of trouble were the minor arguments over mundane household matters. Violet would complain about Donald leaving his clothes on the floor or not doing his share of the chores. Donald, in turn, would criticize Violet for her spending habits or the way she managed her time. These disagreements were brushed off as normal marital spats, but they hinted at deeper issues lurking beneath the surface. Their friends noticed the change but didn't think much of it. After all, every couple had their moments of discord. However, those who spent more time with the Dawsons sensed a growing tension. Violet's laughter seemed more forced, and Donald's affectionate gestures appeared increasingly performative. Yet in public, they maintained their image of the perfect couple, never letting their private conflicts spill into their social life. Despite these early signs, Donald and Violet continued to present a united front. They celebrated anniversaries with lavish dinners and weekend getaways, posted loving messages on social media, and attended couples therapy sessions to work on their issues. But behind closed doors, the fights grew more frequent and intense, setting the stage for the dark and twisted events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. As the months went by, the arguments between Donald and Violet became more frequent and intense. The issues that once seemed trivial now escalated into full-blown fights. Donald's controlling behavior began to surface, and Violet's frustration grew with each passing day. The idyllic image of their marriage was slowly disintegrating, revealing a toxic dynamic that neither of them could escape. Donald's control over Violet extended beyond the household chores. He began dictating how she should dress, whom she could meet, and even how she should spend her free time. Violet, once an independent and confident woman, found herself constantly walking on eggshells trying to avoid Donald's wrath. She started to withdraw from her friends, making excuses for not attending social events or meeting for coffee. Her friends noticed the change, but were unsure how to approach the subject. One evening, during a dinner party at their home, the tension between Donald and Violet was palpable. Violet accidentally spilled wine on the tablecloth, and Donald's reaction was swift and harsh. He berated her in front of their guests, his face contorted with anger. The room fell silent, the awkwardness thick in the air. Violet apologized meekly, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Their friends exchanged uneasy glances, but tried to carry on with the evening, not wanting to exacerbate the situation. After the guests left, Donald continued his tirade. Violet tried to defend herself, but her words only seemed to fuel his anger. It was during these moments that Violet glimpsed the darker side of Donald. a side that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The man she had once admired and loved was now a source of fear and anxiety. Violet confided in her sister Rachel about the growing issues in her marriage. Rachel was shocked to hear about Donald's behavior, as he had always been charming and respectful around her. She urged Violet to consider leaving him, but Violet was hesitant. She still loved Donald and hoped that their issues could be resolved through therapy and open communication. Donald, on the other hand, dismissed the idea of therapy. He believed that Violet was overreacting and that their problems were normal marital issues. He continued to exert control over every aspect of Violet's life. From her work to her friendships, Violet felt increasingly isolated and trapped, her once vibrant personality dimming under the weight of Donald's dominance. The unraveling of Donald and Violet's marriage was rooted in their pasts, hidden traumas and manipulative tendencies that had remained buried until now. Donald's need for control stemmed from his childhood, where he grew up in a household dominated by his tyrannical father. Witnessing his mother's submissiveness and his father's oppressive behavior, Donald internalized the notion that control was synonymous with love and respect. Violet's past was marked by a different kind of trauma. She had been in an abusive relationship during her college years, which left her with deep emotional scars. She had worked hard to rebuild her life, seeking therapy and finding solace in her career. Meeting Donald had seemed like a fresh start, a chance to leave her painful past behind. But as the years went by, the echoes of her past trauma resurfaced, exacerbated by Donald's controlling behavior. Their marriage, which had once seemed like a partnership of equals, transformed into a battleground of wills. Donald's manipulative tendencies became more pronounced, and Violet's hidden traumas were exploited. Donald would use Violet's past against her, belittling her experiences and making her feel unworthy of love and respect. He manipulated her emotions, alternating between affectionate gestures and harsh criticisms, leaving Violet constantly second-guessing herself. Violet's attempts to seek help from friends or family were often thwarted by Donald's interference. He would charm her friends, making them believe that Violet was exaggerating or being overly sensitive. He isolated her from those who could offer support, ensuring that she remained dependent on him. Violet's cries for help were met with skepticism, as Donald's outward charm and charisma masked his true nature. The twisted game of manipulation and control escalated over time. Donald would gaslight Violet, making her doubt her own perceptions and memories. He would hide her belongings, then accuse her of being forgetful. He would criticize her appearance and decisions, undermining her confidence. Violet, caught in this web of psychological abuse, felt her sense of reality slipping away. Despite the escalating abuse, Violet clung to the hope that things could change. She believed that if she just tried harder, if she just loved Donald enough, things would go back to the way they were. She blamed herself for the growing tension, convinced that she was the problem. Donald reinforced this belief, using it to tighten his grip on her. The turning point in Donald and Violet's tumultuous relationship came one night during an argument that escalated beyond verbal altercations. It started as a typical disagreement over household chores, but the tension quickly mounted. Donald's face twisted with anger as he accused Violet of being lazy and ungrateful. Violet, her patience worn thin, snapped back, telling Donald that she was tired of his constant criticism and control. The argument spiraled out of control, with both of them shouting and hurling accusations. Donald's anger boiled over, and for the first time he struck Violet. The force of the blow sent her reeling, her cheek stinging from the impact. The room fell silent, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Donald, momentarily stunned by his own actions, quickly regained his composure and began to apologize profusely. He promised it would never happen again, blaming the stress from work and the pressures of life. Violet, shocked and hurt, didn't know how to respond. She had never imagined that their arguments would turn physical. Despite her fear, a part of her still clung to the hope that Donald could change. She accepted his apology, convincing herself that it was a one-time incident, an unfortunate outburst that wouldn't be repeated. But the physical abuse didn't stop. Over the following weeks, Donald's outbursts became more frequent and violent. Violet tried to hide the bruises, making excuses for her injuries when friends or colleagues asked. She became adept at covering up the signs of abuse, using makeup to mask the bruises and long sleeves to hide the marks. Her once vibrant spirit was replaced by a shadow of her former self, her eyes reflecting a deep-seated fear and sadness. In a desperate attempt to break free from the cycle of abuse, Violet confided in her closest friend, Kate. She told Kate about the physical violence and Donald's controlling behavior, hoping that sharing her secret would give her the strength to leave. Kate was horrified and immediately offered her support, urging Violet to contact a domestic violence hotline and seek help. Violet took Kate's advice and called the hotline. Speaking to a counselor who provided her with resources and a safety plan, she started to make preparations to leave, gathering important documents and saving money in a hidden account. Violet felt a glimmer of hope, believing that she could escape the nightmare her life had become. However, Donald's control over Violet was stronger than she anticipated. He grew suspicious of her actions, noticing the small changes in her behavior and the secretive nature of her movements. His paranoia intensified, and he began to monitor her closely, checking her phone and following her when she left the house. Violet's attempts to break free were thwarted at every turn as Donald tightened his grip on her life. The breaking point came when Violet tried to leave one night, only to be caught by Donald as she was sneaking out of the house with a suitcase. Enraged, Donald dragged her back inside, accusing her of betrayal and threatening her with dire consequences if she ever tried to leave again. Violet, terrified and defeated, realized that escaping Donald's control was more difficult than she had ever imagined. In the days that followed, Donald's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He installed surveillance cameras in the house, monitored Violet's every move, and cut off her access to the outside world. Violet felt like a prisoner in her own home, her every action scrutinized and controlled. The glimmer of hope that had once sustained her was extinguished, replaced by a sense of despair and resignation. The twisted game of manipulation and control had reached a dangerous new level, with Donald's paranoia and violence threatening to consume them both. Despite the overwhelming fear and isolation, Violet continued to hold on to a sliver of hope. She documented the abuse in a hidden journal, detailing each incident with meticulous care. One night, after a particularly violent argument, Violet decided she couldn't take it anymore. The fight had started over a minor issue, Donald accusing her of not cooking dinner to his liking, but it quickly escalated. Donald's rage was uncontrollable, and he beat Violet until she was barely conscious. As she lay on the floor, battered and bleeding, Violet made a silent vow to escape no matter the cost. Over the next few days, Violet meticulously planned her escape. She reached out to Kate through a coded message, arranging a time and place to meet. Kate, understanding the gravity of the situation, agreed to help without hesitation. On the night of their planned escape, Violet waited until Donald was asleep before making her move. She quietly gathered her pre-packed bag and slipped out of the house. Her heart pounded in her chest as she made her way to the meeting spot, every shadow and sound amplifying her fear. Kate was waiting at the designated spot, her car idling and ready to go. Violet climbed into the passenger seat, her hands shaking as she clutched her bag. Kate didn't waste any time, driving away from the house as quickly as possible. The sense of relief Violet felt was overwhelming, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that her freedom was still fragile. They drove to a nearby town, where Kate had arranged for Violet to stay at a women's shelter. The shelter provided a safe haven, a place where Violet could begin to rebuild her life without fear of Donald's retribution. The staff at the shelter were supportive and understanding, helping Violet navigate the legal process of obtaining a restraining order and pressing charges against Donald. For the first time in years, Violet felt a glimmer of hope. She was surrounded by people who believed her, who validated her experiences, and provided her with the support she desperately needed. The journey to recovery was daunting, but Violet was determined to reclaim her life and break free from the cycle of abuse. However, Donald was not willing to let go so easily. When he discovered Violet's absence, his rage knew no bounds. He used every resource at his disposal to track her down, refusing to accept that she had escaped his control. The twisted game of manipulation and control had reached its final, deadly stage, setting the stage for a confrontation that would have tragic consequences. Violet had been staying at the women's shelter for a few weeks, slowly beginning to heal and regain her sense of self. The staff and other residents provided a supportive community, helping her navigate the complexities of her situation. She had obtained a restraining order against Donald, and the shelter had taken measures to ensure her safety. However, Donald's obsession with Violet only grew stronger in her absence. He scoured social media to track her down. His need to control her had reached a dangerous level, driven by a toxic mix of anger, jealousy, and possessiveness. Donald's paranoia and determination to reclaim Violet culminated in a meticulously planned confrontation. On the night of June 27th, Donald finally discovered Violet's location. He had been stalking the shelter for days, watching and waiting for the right moment. When he saw Violet leave the shelter to run an errand, he followed her, careful to remain undetected. Violet was unaware of his presence, her mind occupied with thoughts of her new life and the steps she needed to take to move forward. As Violet returned to the shelter, she felt a strange unease, a sense that something was not right. She quickened her pace, her heart racing as she approached the shelter's entrance. Before she could reach the door, Donald appeared, blocking her path. The look in his eyes was a chilling combination of rage and determination. Donald's voice was low and menacing as he demanded that Violet come with him. Violet tried to remain calm, her voice shaking as she told him to leave and that she had a restraining order against him. But Donald was beyond reason. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful, and started dragging her towards his car. Violet struggled, screaming for help, but the street was deserted and her cries went unanswered. In a desperate bid to break free, Violet managed to pull out her phone and dial 911. The call connected, but before she could speak, Donald slapped the phone out of her hand, sending it crashing to the ground. Violet's panic intensified as she realized the severity of the situation. Donald's anger was palpable, his grip on her arm unrelenting. In a final desperate attempt to escape, Violet kicked Donald and tried to run. But Donald was faster and stronger. He caught up to her and, in a fit of rage, began to beat her mercilessly. Violet's cries for help echoed through the empty street, but no one came to her aid. Donald's fury was uncontrollable, and he didn't stop until Violet lay motionless on the ground. As the reality of what he had done sank in, Donald's rage gave way to panic. He looked around, realizing that the commotion could attract attention. He quickly dragged Violet's body to his car, his mind racing as he tried to think of a plan. He knew he needed to get rid of the evidence and cover his tracks. Donald drove to a remote area outside of town, a place he knew would be deserted at this hour. He put his hand on her neck. There was no pulse. He carried her into the woods, his heart pounding as he dug a shallow grave. He placed her body in the grave, covering it with dirt and debris. Donald's hands shook as he worked, the reality of his actions hitting him with full force. He knew there was no turning back. After burying Violet, Donald returned to his car, his mind racing with thoughts of how to cover his tracks. He disposed of her belongings, including her phone, and cleaned the car meticulously, trying to eliminate any traces of evidence. Donald knew that the police would come looking for him, but he was confident that he could outsmart them. Back at the shelter, the staff discovered Violet's absence and the signs of a struggle near the entrance. They immediately called the police, reporting her missing and providing details of her situation. The police launched an investigation, quickly identifying Donald as the prime suspect. The investigation was swift and thorough. Donald's history of abuse, the restraining order, and his known obsession with Violet made him the obvious suspect. The police tracked his movements, interviewed witnesses, and gathered evidence. It didn't take long for them to piece together the events of that fateful night. Friends and family were interviewed, providing crucial insights into the dynamics of Donald and Violet's relationship. Kate, Violet's closest friend, recounted the numerous times Violet had confided in her about the abuse. She shared the details of Violet's escape plan and their coded messages, revealing the extent of Violet's fear and desperation. Kate's testimony painted a stark contrast between the public image of the Dawsons and the dark reality behind closed doors. Rachel, Violet's sister, spoke of the early signs of trouble she had noticed in their marriage. She described Donald's controlling behavior and the gradual isolation of Violet from her family. Rachel's account of Violet's past trauma and her struggles to rebuild her life added another layer to the understanding of the abuse she had endured. During the interrogation, Donald initially tried to maintain his innocence, but the weight of the evidence was too great. His story unraveled under the pressure, and he eventually confessed to the murder. He described the events of that night with chilling detail, his voice devoid of remorse or empathy. Donald's confession confirmed the police's findings, solidifying the case against him. The community of Riverview was shocked by the revelations. The couple they had once admired and envied had been hiding a dark and twisted reality. The news of Violet's murder and the details of the abuse she had suffered sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The unraveling of Donald and Violet's relationship, from the seemingly perfect marriage to the tragic and violent end, served as a stark reminder of the dangers of domestic abuse. After several days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Donald was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed, and the community of Riverview could begin to heal. The murder of Violet Dawson was a tragic and heartbreaking event that left an indelible mark on the community of Riverview. The seemingly perfect couple, whose public life had been the envy of many, was revealed to have been hiding a dark and twisted reality.